Chapter 120. Good Song, Good Words. Fan Ruoruo smiled and sighed. Miss Sang's singing skills are indeed extraordinary. Sangwon was pleased to receive praise from the famous young lady of the Fan family. She blushed slightly as she bowed. The scenery of winter and the coldness of spring make this scorching summer a bit more refreshing. Lin Wan-er nodded in agreement. Fan Xian had been reborn in the kingdom of Qing for 16 years, but he still didn't like to listen to songs. He often missed Yang Zhongwei's singing from his previous life. Thinking of Yang Zhongwei, he thought of He Zhongwei, who had often come to Fan Manor to pay his respects. He frowned, and for some reason he loathed that gifted scholar. But the line in Sangwen's song, "Suddenly meeting in a white silk robe," had stirred up something in him. The white silk robe consisted of white silk sleeves and a thin silk undergarment, as plain as a white plum blossom. And when he had first met Wan-er in front of the incense burner table in the temple of Qing, hadn't she been wearing a white robe, like a plain plum blossom? But that winter plum blossom had the smell of a chicken leg. Fan Xian unconsciously looked at Lin Wan-er, and found that she was also looking at him. When their eyes met, Fan Xian smiled and Lin Wan-er blushed slightly. Although Yi Ling-er had long since acknowledged Fan Xian's abilities, seeing the dark ripples in front of her still made her feel uncomfortable. She coughed. "I don't really like listening to songs." Fan Xian laughed. "It seems that Miss Yi and I are both coarse people." Calling himself a coarse person was one thing, but his words dragged Yi Ling-er in as well. The other two girls couldn't help but laugh. Even Sangwen, who had been in a daze, couldn't help but cover her mouth. Fan Xian was the only man in the mountain hall. Beside him sat his sister and Wan. Yi Ling-er sat next to Wan-er, and the atmosphere was filled with the faint scent of a young girl. It made Fan Xian feel very good, and he sighed that his life had not been in vain. As long as Princess Rojia wasn't by his side, Fan Xian thought with some fear. Young girls were the most beautiful things in the world, but if they always looked at you as if you were a husband in 10 years, then that wasn't good. At that moment, Sangwon suddenly gathered her courage and curtsied. "I would like to ask Master Fan to say a few words." In the capital, artists competed with their extravagance and the level of their fans. It depended on whether the people who listened to their songs were princes or dukes. But in the end it was still a competition of ability, which was their ability to sing and write songs. Miss Sang had caught the eye of both the princess and the young lady of the Fan family. Naturally, she was an important person, and she thought about her songs and poems day and night. Today by chance she had met Master Fan, who was famous in poetry in the capital. She could no longer be reserved, and regardless of the difference in status, she bravely made this somewhat presumptuous request. Fan Xian was startled, but Lin Wan-er and his sister were already giggling as they allowed him to write. Even Yi Ling-er opened her eyes wide in curiosity, wanting to see what kind of sentence he would come up with. Fan Xian was annoyed to the point that he had no choice but to go into the inner room and lay out some paper and ink. Ruoruo had long since sat down in front of the desk, brush in hand, and waited. It turned out that Fan Xian was just a page boy. The three girls who followed him into the room couldn't help but laugh when they saw this. "My sister's handwriting is better," Fan Xian explained a little awkwardly. Although he had practiced calligraphy diligently in Danzhou, it was still not as beautiful as his sister's, so he simply let her do it. Not long after, Ruoruo had written down a few lines that Fan Xian had recited in small delicate script. When Sangwon first heard it, her eyes brightened. She nervously took the piece of paper and read it carefully. She was overjoyed and bowed to Fan Xian. "Sangwon thanks Master Fan for the poem. Words cannot express my gratitude." Lin Wan-er and Ruoruo also nodded repeatedly, believing that Fan Xian's poem was worthy of the word gratitude. If Sangwon composed a good song and sang it all over the capital, she would probably have a few more good years ahead of her. Fan Xian was copying Tang Xinzu's clever line today, "So the beautiful flowers and purples bloom everywhere, but like this they all give way to broken wells and decadent walls. A beautiful scene on a fine day, but heaven forbid it. Whose courtyard is it to delight the heart and delight the heart? Flying in the morning and rolling in the evening, the rosy clouds and green pavilions, the rain and wind, the smoke and waves of the painted boat, the beautiful screen makes people look at this cheap beauty." Looking at the intoxicated expressions on the faces of the women, he sighed and shook his head. He thought that the whole story of the Peony Pavilion was a wonderful piece of writing. Although it was beautiful, it lacked the spirit of the story. However, he was busy with dating, business, and dating. Even the outing had to last for 2 days. How could he have the time to think about it? It seemed that the work of spreading advanced culture was indeed very difficult. "It's a little too tragic." Yi Ling-er, who had been silent all this time, was a little slow to react. She only now realized the true meaning of the line and spoke sadly. Suddenly Ruoro's expression changed. She thought of the line, "A beautiful scene on a fine day, but heaven forbid it." It had already appeared in Story of the Stone, where Lin Daiyu played the drinking game. If Sangwon sang this line all over the capital, wouldn't people immediately know that Story of the Stone had been written by her brother? But seeing that Fan Xian seemed to have forgotten about it, and that deep in her heart she also wanted her brother to make a name for himself, she couldn't help but smile, and she didn't mention it again. The outing ended satisfactorily. Everyone got what they wanted before they came. Yi Linger got some tricks, Sangwon got Fan Xian's poem, Fan Xizha got a belly full of roasted fish and meat, and De Bao got a horseback to the Prime Minister's manor. Fan Ruoro got 2 days of elegant scenery to clear her mind, and Lin Wanner got the chance to get close to her brother. Fan Xian got the most, but he couldn't say it. If it ended like this, everyone would be happy. But when Fan Xian heard Wang Qinyan's report, he frowned. He really hadn't expected things to be so coincidental. The Crown Prince was coming. Retreat. Hearing that the Crown Prince was coming to the summer residence that day, Fan Xian didn't say anything else. He ordered Wang Qinyan to arrange for his group to retreat back to the capital. What a joke. If the Crown Prince was coming to spend the summer, would he dare fight for territory with him? Furthermore, the Fan family had always been considered part of the Second Prince's faction. The Prime Minister had broken off relations with the Eastern Palace, and the Overwatch Council was clinging to the Emperor. Although the power behind Fan Xian was great, they were all the Crown Prince's most hated targets. If the two sides really did meet, even if Fan Xian had a fake princess at his side and the young ladies of the Yi and Fan families, if the Crown Prince really wanted to humiliate him, Fan Xian would have no one to go to. The Emperor had said at the Green Bamboo Tea House by the Lujing River that Fan Xian should be able to live comfortably in the capital. But the Crown Prince probably didn't like Fan Xian being comfortable. If there was a difference of opinion between father and son, Fan Xian didn't have the arrogance to think that the Emperor would deal with his own son for the sake of a mere official son. So he had to retreat cleanly and efficiently. He didn't want to give the Crown Prince a chance to see him or humiliate him. At the same time, he didn't want to give himself a chance to be humiliated and beat the Crown Prince after he was humiliated, committing a heaven-defying crime. He had come confidently, but now he had to retreat in fear. Fan Xian didn't feel good about it. Lin Wanner frowned unhappily. Brother Qingqian wasn't a tiger, so why was her husband so afraid? Yi Linger also looked down on Fan Xian, who was afraid of the nobility. So what if he was the Crown Prince? When he was young, the Emperor had sent him to the Yi family to learn martial arts. She had beaten him up too. After all, Fan Xian was only an 8th-level functionary, a mere illegitimate son of Count Sinan. He wasn't like these two girls who had been in and out of the palace since they were young, and were used to seeing the world's top figures. Furthermore, his thoughts were much more mature than these girls, and he knew that this matter was a bit sensitive. Because he had arranged things quickly, by the time the Crown Prince's entourage was about to arrive at the summer estate, Fan Xian's entourage was already on the official road. The two sides brushed past each other. At that moment, a gong rang out as if a performance was about to begin. The Crown Prince's entourage stopped, and a palace guard called for Fan Xian's entourage to stop as well. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked out expressionlessly. In the bright yellow carriage, the Crown Prince's entourage, the future most powerful man in the world, was weakly talking to the carriage behind him. The Crown Prince, Li Qingqian, had handsome features, but he didn't look well. His face was a bit pale and the corners of his lips were a bit black. He had come to the mountain resort to spend the summer. He hadn't expected to see Wanner and the girl from the Yi family on the road. They had grown up together, so he had stopped to chat. Knowing that Wanner had spent the night at the summer estate, Li Qingqian's heart ached. "Why don't you take care of your body?" he said. "The imperial doctor said that you are most afraid of cold." Yi Linger laughed and interjected. "Sister Lin, you don't have to worry about that. You have a famous doctor by your side." Lin Wanner frowned and looked at Yi Linger. "It's already summer," she explained with a smile. "How could I catch a cold?" But he didn't change the subject. The Crown Prince was very curious about what Yi Linger was talking about, and asked for more details. Only then did he learn that the person in the carriage in front of them was Wanner's future husband. He was very surprised. The Fan family's underground fighter? He has become famous recently. Quickly have him come and let me take a look. "Forget it, Your Highness. Don't scare him," said Lin Wanner awkwardly. The Crown Prince frowned. The Emperor's family has a few poor relatives. In the future when you are married he will be my brother-in-law. What is there to be afraid of? Besides, in a few days, father will summon him to the palace to pay his respects to the concubines. He paused for a moment, then continued, moreover, the imperial court is about to give him a position. Could it be that he still wants to hide? These words were extremely heavy, and the two carriages immediately quietened down. Greetings, Your Highness. A voice broke the silence. At some point, Fan Xian had arrived in front of the Crown Prince's carriage. He smiled and bowed. Chapter 121. The Crown Prince, Li Qingqian, had a weak temperament and a weak body. This was what Fan Xian knew of the Crown Prince. After bowing, he raised his head somewhat rudely and looked at the Crown Prince with a slight smile. Although the Crown Prince's identity was noble, Fan Xian felt that he and the Emperor had both drunk tea and chatted. Facing his son he would not be too nervous. He had not wanted to come out and meet the Crown Prince, but the talkative Yi Linger had shattered his fantasy. When Fan Xian looked at the Crown Prince looked back at him with interest. For the Crown Prince, the fact that Fan Xian's name had shaken the capital in just a few short months was already an anomaly. Furthermore, his father had appointed him to marry one. As the master of the Eastern Palace, the Crown Prince was well aware of the meaning behind it. If the eldest princess lost the right to manage the palace treasury, and the person who took over was an enemy, the messy debts of the past would come to light. This was what the Crown Prince was most worried about. Fortunately, it would take another 2 years for the palace treasury to change hands, so it was not an urgent matter. But the Fan family was on good terms with King Jing, and Crown Prince Jing's son Li Hongqing was on good terms with his second brother. The Crown Prince frowned slightly. Looking at the beautiful young man below the carriage, he momentarily forgot to speak. The advisors in the Eastern Palace were now divided into two factions. Whether to attack or pull the Fan family was still being considered. If it was a normal manner, the Crown Prince would not care too much. But the Fan family was different. The grandmother of the young man before him was his father's wet nurse. With this layer of relationship, the Crown Prince could not do anything to the Fan family. You are Fan Xian? The Crown Prince finally realized that he was a little absent-minded. After a slight pause he asked with a smile. Your subject Fan Xian greets the Crown Prince. Fan Xian bowed again with great respect. I did not know the Crown Prince's carriage was here, so I did not get out. Please forgive me, Your Highness. Looking at Fan Xian's elegant face, for some reason, the Crown Prince's original dislike for him lessened. In that instant he decided to temporarily wait and see. He quietly said, those who do not know are not guilty. But my sister Wanner is weak and sickly. You must pay more attention to her. Do not be like those youths in the capital who only seek temporary pleasure. I'm afraid. Fan Xian could tell that the Crown Prince was not planning to deal with him today. He felt slightly at ease and replied gently. Don't be too cautious. After the wedding in October, you'll be considered a relative of the country. You'll have to visit the palace often, so you should be more relaxed, the Crown Prince lectured. Fan Xian smiled slightly and replied yes. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince's next words surprised him. Envoys from Dongyi and Northern Qi will soon enter the capital. Because the incident at Nyolan Street is related to you, the court has decided to make you a deputy and temporarily raise your rank. I am informing you ahead of time so that you can make some preparations and not panic. The Crown Prince spoke lightly, thinking that he had unknowingly done Fan Xian a favor. Fan Xian paused for a moment, then said, I am the functionary of Taichang Temple. I am afraid it would be inappropriate for me to participate in national negotiations. The Crown Prince snorted coldly and said, if you don't have any achievements, how are you going to face yourself in court in the future? Fan Xian could tell that the Crown Prince was a little angry. He quickly agreed and thanked the Crown Prince, then moved aside to make way. The Crown Prince waved the black horsewhip in his hand with golden threads and nodded his head in satisfaction. He then turned to Lin Wanner and warmly said, you should go to the palace more often. I miss you very much. He paused and then said, recently I often have a headache. There was nothing strange in the Crown Prince's voice, and his expression was as gentle as ever. But Fan Xian could see a trace of unease in the Crown Prince's cowardly eyes. Lin Wanner smiled and said nothing. Crown Prince, let's go. The Crown Prince's carriages began to move, moving slowly in the direction of the mountain resort. Fan Xian didn't dare move until the carriages had disappeared at the end of the road. Only then did he let out a sigh and stretch his stiff waist. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. Being an official is a tough life. Don't tell me you dare have thoughts of disloyalty? Yi Ling mocked him. Ling don't talk nonsense. Xijia was afraid of Ruoruo, and Yi Ling was afraid of the little tiger. Lin Wan was angry and Yi Ling immediately jumped back into the carriage. Lin Wan walked to Fan Xian's side and saw that he was still looking in the direction the carriage had disappeared in. She couldn't help but sigh. I know what you're worried about. But none of my 3 brothers are easy to get along with. I think it's best if you don't side with any of them. Fan Xian had always acknowledged Lin Wan's political wisdom, which she had cultivated deep in the palace. He nodded solemnly, then suddenly thought of something. What about the youngest prince? Is he also a difficult person to deal with? Wen Yun is only 8 years old. He doesn't understand these things. Lin Wan continued to comfort him. The nominal position of Taichung Temple's son-in-law, joining in on the ceremonial negotiations, has been done before. It's not as if the Eastern Palace really wants to recruit you. Don't worry. Fan Xian smiled, thinking that he was already quite relaxed, but he still faked a sigh. It's just that when I see the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace, the future ruler of the Kingdom of Qing, I can't help but feel nervous. Was strange. Although in his previous life, the highest official Fan Xian had seen before his illness had only been the headmaster of a school, after his rebirth, perhaps because he had been born into a family of officials, he didn't feel nervous when he saw important people. Even when he saw the emperor a few days ago, he was able to hide it well. Lin Wan couldn't help but laugh. She pulled on his sleeve. Didn't you hear what the crown prince said? Before the wedding, you have to go to the palace to pay your respects to the various concubines. If that ancestor is happy, it's not impossible for him to see you. After walking through a dozen palaces, even if you're nervous, you'll become numb. Ancestor? Fan Xian knew that Lin Wan was talking about the Empress Dowager, who lived deep in the palace. For some reason he shivered. Let's go. Your Highness has already gone so far. Why are you still standing there looking at the horses? But Fan Xijia, who had been silent for a long time, finally couldn't help but yell from the carriage in front. De Bao, who was in the carriage in the middle, heard someone yelling and also yelled happily. Fan Xian laughed. With a wave of his sleeve, he threw all these thoughts to the back of his mind. In Fan Xian's mind, since he was lucky enough to live again, he had to live it to the fullest. Women, money, power, he couldn't complain that it was too little. But after entering the capital, he saw the murky waters and couldn't tell how deep they were. He couldn't help but feel annoyed. Dombo Bookstore's business was good. The last few chapters of Story of the Stone were about to be printed, and money was coming in. In the future, even if he took over the palace treasury, he would find a way to leave it to Qingyu Hall and Fan Xijia. As for the matters of the court, his father, Qin Pingping, and his mother's former comrades would stand in front of him. As for the dangers lurking in the dark, he had Uncle Wu Zhu as his bodyguard. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu didn't want to see the sun like that time on Yolan Street, Fan Xian felt that he had the ability to protect himself. So all of a sudden, he felt that he had the potential to become a free and unfettered rich man. This was still just a fantasy. He and the people around him all knew this. Snapping his fingers, Fan Xian looked calmly at the dirt road outside the carriage window. What a coincidence, he said. North, south, east, west and west of the capital, there are 13 royal residences, 2 temporary imperial residences and 1 hunting ground. Given the crown prince's status, he could use any of them. Why did he come to the summer estate today? The summer resort is far from the capital and it's quiet. That's why we chose this place first. After setting off again, he and Wang Qinian were alone in the carriage, so they spoke very directly. Wang Qinian also frowned. If someone deliberately let the crown prince come to the summer resort so that we could have a conflict with the crown prince, this kind of arrangement is too complicated, and it won't necessarily be effective. Fan Xian shook his head, a slight chill in his eyes. As long as there are people by the crown prince's side, it wouldn't be difficult to slightly influence the crown prince's destination. And my reputation in the capital has always been based on the word arrogant. I reckon that whoever arranged for us to meet the crown prince by chance wouldn't have thought that the crown prince wouldn't be angry at me for stealing his silver, and that I would behave myself. It's just that I don't know the rules of the palace. For example, how long does it usually take for the crown prince to travel out of the capital? We arrived at the summer resort yesterday. If the crown prince decided to come here a few days ago, then we can be sure that this was a coincidence, and not an arrangement by someone with ulterior motives. Wang Qinian analyzed. Fan Xian shook his head again. I already asked the princess when I was in the carriage. When the crown prince travels, as long as he doesn't stray more than 28 miles from the capital, then he only needs to report to the palace. All the preparations will take about a day. Looking at the time we met, the crown prince will probably leave the palace this morning. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian worriedly and said in a low voice, "What benefit could the person who arranged this matter have?" Fan Xian laughed. "There are many benefits. If the crown prince really humiliates me, I reckon that the Fan family will have no choice but to carry the flag and show our allegiance." "Is it the second prince?" Wang Qinian probed. Fan Xian thought that during this period of time after entering the capital, the second prince had repeatedly summoned him, but he had never met him. He really didn't know what kind of character this man who was unwilling to be a peaceful prince was. However, he would not judge everything arbitrarily. In a quiet voice he said, "Who knows? Everyone in the palace is like a demon. I don't care." It would be a lie to say that he didn't care. He still arranged for Wang Qinian to get out of the carriage to see if anyone was following them. He believed that with Wang Qinian's ability, if someone was secretly watching him on the official road, then he would certainly be able to catch them. If there was no one watching over his caravan to facilitate that chance encounter on the official road, then it could only mean that he was overly sensitive and paranoid. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and leaned against the soft cushions of the carriage, hoping that he really was being overly sensitive. Chapter 122. There was a house on the side of Xinjing Road in the capital. Wang Qinian had spent 120 taels of silver to buy it. There had been a number of procedures and he believed that no one would be able to find out who the real owner was. Fan Xian frowned as he looked at the two men tied up tightly in the corner. Their mouths were stuffed full of smelly rags and their faces were red. Tears were streaming from the corners of their eyes. They couldn't speak and they couldn't kill themselves by biting their tongues. Where were they caught? Fan Xian asked quietly. The 4th Bureau personnel behind Wang Qinian bowed and replied, 7 miles outside the city, Sir Wang found traces of the other party. After they were stopped by us, they tried to quibble, but they couldn't withstand our investigation, so they admitted to it. After you left the capital yesterday, these 2 people have been following you. I don't know what method they used to inform their people, but I don't know what relationship they have with the Eastern Palace to arrange this coincidental meeting. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He had not thought that his random guess would actually reveal a clue to a conspiracy. It looked like it was not that he was too wise, but that his enemies were too stupid. Jingdo was too dark and everyone had a forked black tail behind them. He also understood that the investigation his subordinate spoke of must have involved torture. But since they had admitted to it, no one cared what methods they used. Did you find out who they were? Fan Xian asked Wang Qinian in a low voice. Wang Qinian shook his head. The less I know, the better. So I waited for you to interrogate them personally. Fan Xian nodded. He was happy with his cautiousness, but then he fell into deep thought. He looked at the 2 men in the corner and could easily see something else in their eyes. They had such a determined expression, but had not been trained in torture. Firstly, they couldn't be from the Overwatch Council, and secondly, they couldn't be from the palace. They had already been examined and found not to be eunuchs. So the most likely culprit was the second prince's personal power. Of course, the great prince at the foot of Yin Mountain couldn't escape suspicion. At that moment, Fan Xian suddenly thought of something his father Count Sinan had said. When you don't know who your enemy is, don't make random enemies. Even if you know who your enemy is, so what? If he found out that it was the second prince who did it, could he really kill his way into the manor? Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that some things were better left unclarified. There's no need to ask. Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows. It seemed he was a bit depressed there. Kill them all. Yes. His subordinates were all malicious spirits of the Overwatch Council, so they were not surprised by this bloody order. They calmly walked forward, pulled out the knives at their sides, and stabbed them into the waist of the 2 men. 2 spluttering sounds rang out, and the 2 men's feet kicked wildly. Their eyes rolled back and they died. Bury him properly, Fan Xian ordered. He didn't put on any pretentious expression of sorrow. Yes, the subordinate replied. After leaving the courtyard, they walked through the small alleys of the capital for a long time before they stepped onto the main road. Wang Qinian accompanied him for a walk, maintaining the silence and courtesy that a subordinate should have. Fan Xian suddenly said, "When will the envoys from northern Qi and Dongyi arrive? The council should have this information." Wang Qinian replied, "From the moment they entered the country, the 4th Bureau has been assisting the local authorities in receiving them. Judging by the date, they should arrive at the beginning of next month." Fan Xian nodded. "Help me find out who they are. Also," he paused for a moment, "if this doesn't count as breaking the rules, Could I trouble the council to ask our spies in Northern Qi to bring back some information? It would be best if they could find out what the bottom line the Northern Qi envoys are negotiating with is. Wang Qinian had heard the Crown Prince's words earlier, so he knew that Master Fan was going to be the assistant envoy. He spoke in a low voice. Yan Bingyun, the son of the head of the 4th Bureau Yan Ruahai, has been lurking in Northern Qi for 4 years. He's had some success, so I reckon he should have some good information. Fan Xian reminded him, don't talk about this kind of thing too much in the future. If Northern Qi found out, I'm afraid Master Yan's son would be in danger. Wang Qinian smiled. Master, as the commissioner, you have the authority to know about this. Fan Xian also smiled. It's better to know less about this kind of thing that involves taking responsibility. Wang Qinian looked at the gentle smile on Fan Xian's handsome face and thought of the murders in the council. He couldn't help but feel a little strange. If it's better not to know, then why do you still need to investigate? The deaths of those 2 men don't seem necessary. Fan Xian calmly replied, although it's better not to know, we still need to investigate. Those 2 men must die. Because I have to let others know that I know what they don't want me to know. The 2 lives are a warning to them not to try to manipulate me again. It seems that Nyolan Street didn't make those high and mighty people behave themselves. The death of my brother-in-law at the foot of the Tsang Mountains was caused by Sigu Jian. Perhaps they think I'm easy to bully? Although the series of no was a bit of a tongue twister, and Wang Qinian was a bit confused, he gradually understood the meaning and nodded. Fan Xian suddenly smiled. Don't worry. I've never seen blood or dead people. You don't know how I grew up. In the days that followed, the world was peaceful. The deaths of the 2 nameless men didn't seem to matter. But Fan Xian was sure that this matter had already begun to take effect. Occasionally he would go to Taichung Temple to do his morning roll. Occasionally he would go to Dambo bookstore to collect money. Occasionally he would go to the tofu shop to work. Occasionally he would go to the Prime Minister's manor to get closer to his future father-in-law. Occasionally he would sneak into the royal courtyard to fall in love. Occasionally he would stay at Fan Manor to tell his sister stories and copy books. That night he washed up and prepared to go to bed. His gaze fell on the black leather suitcase that had been carelessly tossed to the side. He didn't know what was in the suitcase, so he was naturally curious. But after staying in the same room for so long and not knowing where the key went, he couldn't help but feel a bit numb. Of course, if he knew that Qin Pingping also cared about the suitcase, he would certainly reevaluate its value. He wouldn't just toss it in the room like trash. Instead, he would dig a large hole under the bed and cover it with 3 layers of steel. Where was the key? It was as if God had suddenly heard the greatest question in his heart. A cold voice rang out in Fan Xian's ear. The key is in the palace. Then, without any wind, a black stick came from the heavens and smashed viciously into Fan Xian's back. There was a muffled sound. Fan Xian couldn't dodge in time, and was heavily knocked to the ground. His back hurt and he coughed in pain, blowing a few strands of dust from his face. You've regressed. Although Wu Zhu's voice was emotionless, it was clear that he held a rather negative attitude towards Fan Xian's performance. Uncle? Fan Xian had grown accustomed to this kind of life. With great difficulty he crawled up from the ground. He slowly circulated the Jinqi in his body, alleviating the pain in his back. Looking at the dark corner of the wall, he couldn't help but whisper, Uncle, I haven't seen you for so many days. I've been worried to death. Wu Zhu was not used to the passion in his words. He coldly took half a step back and coldly cut through Fan Xian's lies. I know. You're not worried about me. Fan Xian smiled somewhat bitterly. He really wasn't worried. Wu Zhu was a perverted grandmaster assassin. He believed that no matter where he went he would be fine. But Fan Xian hadn't seen him for a long time and he really did miss him. He was curious as to what he had been up to. Perhaps Uncle Wu Zhu had always been by his side and he didn't know? Wu Zhu continued, the key is in the palace. The second repetition brought Fan Xian back to his senses. He frowned slightly and then suddenly understood. So you've been looking for the key all this time. This is the lady's relic. I shouldn't have listened to Qin Pingping and left the key in the capital. Wu Zhu's tone was still indifferent. I've been looking in the palace for a few days, and I've come up with 3 possible places. Too risky. Fan Xian growled in a low voice. Deep in his heart he was a little angry. Although Wu Zhu had the power of a grandmaster, the palace was no place to be trifled with. The guards were all experts, and Fei Jia had once mentioned that the most mysterious of the 4 grandmasters had always been hidden within the palace. Wu Zhu had risked staying in the palace for so many days. If he had been discovered, the mysterious grandmaster would have acted. With the addition of 500 armed guards, even if Wu Zhu's skills were divine, he wouldn't have been able to come out alive. As if he hadn't noticed Fan Xian's anger, Wu Zhu continued to speak. Do you want the key? Fan Xian calmed down. He understood why Wu Zhu had come today. Wu Zhu had always been a person who hid in the dark. If there wasn't something they needed to talk about, Fan Xian suspected that Wu Zhu would never see him again, and would only protect him from the shadows. And tonight, Wu Zhu had come to ask for the key, not to ask for Fan Xian's opinion, but because this matter required his participation. But, if it was difficult for Wu Zhu to take something from this world, what could Fan Xian help him with? As Fan Xian thought about it, he said quietly, What do you need me to do? There are 3 places in the palace that are difficult to enter, Wu Zhu said expressionlessly. Fan Xian was curious about which 3 places they were and asked. Xingqing Palace, Hongguang Palace and Guangxin Palace. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Within the palace, these 3 places were the most heavily guarded. They were the residences of the emperor, the empress dowager, and the eldest princess. Not only were they the most difficult places to enter in the palace, but they were also the most difficult places in the world. I want you to think of a way to get the eunuch Hong Xixiang out of the palace for 2 hours. Fan Xian frowned slightly. Eunuch Hong? The head of the palace eunuchs, a senior statesman of 3 dynasties. I heard that he has been in the palace since the founding of the nation, and has great power. But if you want to steal the key from the palace, why do you want me to trick him out of the palace? What does this have to do with anything? He suddenly understood something and raised his head in surprise to look at the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face. With a trembling voice, he said, Could it be that Eunuch Hong is the most mysterious grandmaster in the legends? Fei Jie had once said that of the 4 great grandmasters, one was Sigu Jian of Dongyi City, another was Ku He, the imperial advisor of northern Qi, and another was Yi Luyun of the kingdom of Qin. The last one was also from the kingdom of Qin, but no one knew who he was. Even with the power of the Overwatch Council, they could only vaguely sense that this great grandmaster was hiding in the royal palace of the kingdom of Qin. Wu Zhu shook his head. I don't know. I haven't fought him, but I do know that in the palace, the one who can most easily find me is the eunuch Hong Xixiang. Fan Xian nodded. In his mind, given Wu Zhu's cautiousness, this old eunuch Hong must be an unfathomable figure in the palace. If even Wu Zhu was afraid of him, then perhaps eunuch Hong's identity as a grandmaster was already on the verge of being revealed. Given Wu Zhu's cold temperament, he could even kill Yi Luyun, but he couldn't kill him. Naturally, he wouldn't fear any grandmaster in the world. Last time, he had attacked violently to hide his relationship with Fan Xian. This time, however, he was trying to steal the key, so his style was somewhat different. Fan Xian thought about his recent arrangements, connecting the matter of envoys from northern Qi and Dongyi, but he still couldn't think of a good way to establish a relationship with the head eunuch in the palace. It was also not convenient to ask his father for help, otherwise he would have to explain many things that he didn't want to explain. Suddenly his eyes brightened. Wan should know about the palace. She lived in the palace until the beginning of this year, and only moved out at the beginning of this year. Tomorrow I'll go see her. Wu Zhu looked at him non-committally and said coldly, I only want you to drag Hong Xixiang out of the palace for 2 hours. As for how you do it, that's your business. Fan Xian shrugged. Uncle, you always give me the most difficult tasks. This was a naughty joke, and he hadn't talked to Wu Zhu for a while, so he seemed to have forgotten that Wu Zhu didn't have much of a sense of humor. Wu Zhu said seriously, Then I'll go kill Hong Xixiang. Whether I succeed or not, I can probably stall him for 6 hours. You go to the palace and find the key. Fan Xian found that he had picked up a hot meteorite and smashed it on his foot. He quickly said with the utmost respect, It's just to steal something. It's not too risky to challenge Hong Xixiang. I'll try to get in touch with him. After Wu Zhu left, Fan Xian remembered that he couldn't find him. If he did arrange everything in the future, how would he inform this blind uncle? Lying back on the bed, he looked at the black suitcase in a different way. If the key had to be placed in the most heavily guarded place in the palace, then there must be something very important or terrifying hidden inside the suitcase. For example, a map of the border, a list of high-ranking spies in the Overwatch Council that his mother had created, or a map of the Yi family's treasure? Fan Xian could no longer sleep peacefully. He stood up and kicked the suitcase under the bed as if he felt that it would be much safer this way. Fan Xian calmly went to Ruoruo's room and asked her for some needles for sewing. Ruoruo couldn't dissuade him, so she took out a few small needles from the box and handed them to him. She was curious. Looking into her brother's eyes, she asked, This is for embroidery. Is your clothes torn? You can give it to the servant girl. Fan Xian smiled. It's much more complicated than sewing clothes. He thought for a moment, then said, don't let anyone know that I took 3 needles from you. Fan Ruoro nodded, confused. The wedding was imminent, and Fan Manor had already begun preparations. There was something strange about Fan Xian and Lin Wanner's marriage, so all the rules had to be re-established. At least it wouldn't be like other consorts, where the royal family arranged the prince consort's mansion. After all, Lin Wanner's status as a princess had always been limited to the palace. If it were to be done in the capital, it would probably give rise to rumors. The newly married mansion was next to Count Sinan's. It was just an empty garden, but Fan Xian had begun preparations for it at the beginning of the year, so it had long since been taken care of in splendor. There was a door in the back garden of the 2 courtyards, so the front and back manors were connected. The main entrance to Fan Xian's courtyard was on the opposite side of the street. It had been very quiet in the past few days. The workers had stopped working long ago, and the trees and rockery had long been taken care of. They were nourished by the wind and water. Because there weren't many people around, the large courtyard seemed very quiet. No one wanted to stay there for long. A black shadow floated by. It was Fan Xian. He had quietly come to the courtyard, holding a piece of tofu in his right hand and 3 silver needles between the 4 fingers of his left hand. He found a secluded place and carefully placed the tofu cubes between the branches of the willow tree. The tofu had become extremely tender after he had improved it, so it was placed there trembling as if it could break at any time. Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly increased the tyrannical Jinqi in his dantian. It flowed through the top of his head and into the snow mountain behind his waist, forming 2 Jinqi channels, one large and one small. He allowed his entire body to enter a state of tranquility, without a single stray thought. The wind rose, and Fan Xian's entire body became a gust of wind, blowing toward the center of the willow tree. With a light touch, the tips of his feet valiantly stopped his forward fall, and with a sudden sound, he used his control of his body to bounce back. It was like a crafty fish playing with a fool's hook. After a while, he slowly walked forward with his hands behind his back, squinting at the piece of tofu in the willow tree branch. There were 3 thin needles on the tofu and they were trembling slightly. In that split second, he had inserted the needles into the tofu with incredible speed and arranged them in the shape of a triangle. Based on Fan Xian's understanding of the human body, if this technique was used to kill someone, it would certainly be very effective. He retrieved the needles with satisfaction. Ever since Nyolan Street, he had been searching for a weapon that suited him best. Wu Zhu's weapon was a stick-shaped object. Whether it was a wooden stick or a simple iron drill in Wu Zhu's hands, it was a deadly weapon. This was the result of his realm. Fan Xian knew very well that for him, a handy weapon could save his life many times. In fact, he very much liked the slender dagger in his boot. Whether it was in Danzhou or Nyolan Street, the sharp dagger that Fei Jie had left behind had already helped him twice. However, this dagger could not be brought into certain places such as the royal palace. And Fan Xian knew that since the key was in the royal palace, he was afraid that, in the end, he would have to be like the swordsman in the novels of his previous life, and break through the forbidden area. Wu Zhu's stick and words yesterday had stimulated him a little, and he had found some passion again. He looked at the 3 needles on his finger reflecting the light of the rising sun, and couldn't help but frown. What kind of poison should he apply to them? Once he had a goal, he did things with passion. So when Fan Xian passionately entered Lin Wanner's boudoir on a dark night, she couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. After all, it hadn't been that long since their last outing. After a moment of intimacy, Fan Xian pretended to casually ask about matters in the royal palace. Lin Wanner had grown up in the royal palace and was quite familiar with its people. She wasn't curious why her fiancé was suddenly interested in this. She thought that Fan Xian was worried about the rules of entering the royal palace to pay his respects, so she comforted him. The concubines in the royal palace are all very good to me, and His Majesty doesn't like women, so it's not like the old emperor of Northern Qi who died a few years ago, who had an endless supply of beauties. Besides Her Majesty, there are also the great prince's mother, Ning the Talented, the second prince's mother, Lady Shu, the third prince's mother, Igui Pin, and a few other concubines. I don't think I need to pay my respects. Fan Xian thought that those concubines naturally wouldn't want to offend her mother, the eldest princess, who was deeply favored by the Empress Dowager and controlled the palace treasury. He shifted his body on the bed to make holding one more comfortable. Why is the great prince's mother only a talented person? He asked curiously. Lin Wanner explained, Ning the Talented is from Dongyi. She was captured by His Majesty on his first northern expedition. I heard that on the battlefield, His Majesty was injured, and Ning the Talented took care of him day and night. So His Majesty freed her from slavery, and she entered the royal palace, where she gave birth to the great prince. But after all, she wasn't a citizen of Qin, so even though she saved the emperor and gave birth to his eldest son, she still couldn't win the Empress Dowager's favor, so she couldn't be made empress. Besides, she was already an imperial concubine. But 10 years ago, something happened in the royal palace. His Majesty was furious and he stripped her of her position, demoting her to a talented person. Fan Xian was slightly startled, thinking that the struggles in the royal palace were as complicated as he had imagined. Lin Wan sighed and continued, "Fortunately, eldest brother's military exploits in the West are outstanding, so Ning the Talented is able to maintain her position in the royal palace. But now she seems to understand many things and is quite content in the royal palace. In fact, I used to often go to her royal palace to play, but I haven't gone as often in the past 2 years." Fan Xian asked about some of the secrets of the royal palace, and Lin Wan didn't hide anything from him. In the end, Fan Xian finally asked about the topic of the night. Very casually he said, "I hear that the head of the eunuchs, Eunuch Hong, is very powerful in the royal palace." Yes. Lin Wan was not a little tiger that night, but a kitten. She snuggled in his arms and gently rubbed her face. Eunuch Hong has been in the royal palace since the founding of the country. When the previous emperor was on the throne, he was trusted. Today he still maintains his position as the head of the eunuchs, but he is old and doesn't care much. He basically stays in the Empress Dowager's palace. In the Empress Dowager's palace? Fan Xian's heart suddenly surged with many dark historical memories. "What is it?" Lin Wan asked curiously, her 2 large eyes blinking. Fan Xian pinched the tip of her cold nose and smiled. "It's nothing. It's just that if I want to have a good relationship with the royal palace, I have to do something about Eunuch Hong." "That won't be necessary," Lin Wan explained. "This old eunuch only walks around the royal palace. He doesn't care much." Fan Xian couldn't tell the woman in his arms about his plans, so he could only smile. "Leave a message for me to see when the royal palace will summon me." Lin Wan was embarrassed, but she didn't forget to tease him. "I think it'll be a few days." "What? Are you in a hurry?" "Of course I'm in a hurry. With such a good daughter-in-law outside, who wouldn't be in a hurry?" Gradually, the second floor of the building in the royal palace returned to silence. Looking at his fiancée sleeping soundly in his arms, Fan Xian unconsciously sighed. There were always many other things in life and he hoped he could handle them well. The next day when he went to Taichung Temple for morning attendance, Ren Shaoqing mysteriously pulled him to one side and lowered his voice. "Do you know about that matter?" Fan Xian looked at the man's 30 or 40-year-old face, which still had traces of the handsomeness of the past, and played dumb. "What matter?" Ren Shaoqing sighed. "The office of the Grand Herald sent a message this morning, saying that they want to transfer you over there." The office of the Grand Herald was responsible for receiving foreign guests and handling matters between countries. Fan Xian was startled. He knew that the matter the Crown Prince was talking about had begun. He cupped his hands and asked, "Sir, why do you want me to be transferred over there? I've only been at Taichung Temple for a dozen days." Ren Shaoqing frowned. "Does Sir Fan have any connections in the Eastern Palace?" Fan Xian knew that he was asking about his father. He shook his head. "You know that my father rarely interacts with the palace, not even with the ministers." "That's true." Vice Minister Ren nodded. Count Sinan was famous for his stubbornness. Taking advantage of the special relationship he had with the emperor, he didn't even pay attention to the prime minister in the past, and was always on equal footing with the other princes. Ren Shaoqing thought for a moment. "I heard that the Eastern Palace suggested that you participate in this negotiation." Fan Xian didn't know how to respond, so he continued to play dumb. "What negotiation?" "The envoy from Northern Qi is here to discuss the aftermath of the war between the vassal states of the northern frontier, such as the payment of money. The envoy from Dongyi is here to deal with the assassination attempt on the second son of the prime minister at the foot of the Tsang Mountains. I heard that he brought a lot of money and beautiful women. The so-called negotiation is to see how the imperial court haggles with these two places." Ren Xiao was the prime minister's disciple, so he naturally saw Fan Xian as one of his own. He cautiously reminded him. "If this matter is handled well, it will only be the icing on the cake. In any case, the soldiers have sacrificed their lives to conquer those territories. But if it is not handled well and we don't get the benefits that the emperor expects, then it will be very inappropriate. As for Dongi, this matter involves the death of the second son. If you are too weak, it will be difficult to explain yourself to the Prime Minister. But since the Imperial Court has allowed the Dongi envoy to come, it proves that the Imperial Court doesn't want to pursue this matter too much. They only want to get some benefits. After all, Dongi still has Sigujian. Fan Xian frowned. These matters were indeed complicated. Rin Xiao, and continued with concern. Your identity is special. You and the Prime Minister are about to become father and son-in-law. If you try to cater to the Emperor's wishes, you will lose your father's wishes. So this is a very awkward situation. You must be careful. Fan Xian was startled. Only then did he realize the crux of the matter. He gratefully cupped his hands in salute. I am new to officialdom and I don't know the intricacies of this, but this matter is a bit complicated. I am only an 8th level functionary. Even if the office of the Herald of Ceremonies sends me to assist, I fear that my words will carry little weight. Rin Xiao, and shook his head and sighed. This time you are the deputy envoy. You are at the peak of the storm. Who knows how many eyes are watching you? Why are they watching me? Thinking this, Fan Xian smiled and said, You worry too much, sir. There should be no problem. Indeed, Rin Xiao, and had worried too much. Although he didn't know what the Eastern Palace meant by sending him to be the deputy envoy, whether it was to rope him in or to make him lose the Emperor's wishes, Fan Xian had already made sufficient preparations. He was not afraid. In the afternoon, an official's sedan chair came to pick him up. It traveled along the bluestone path, and in less than a quarter of an hour, the sedan chair entered the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. The office of the Herald of Ceremonies was equivalent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of later generations. The Minister of the Office of the Herald of Ceremonies was equivalent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In his previous life, Fan Xian believed in a saying, a weak country has no diplomacy. Now that the Kingdom of Qing was the most powerful country in the world, the office of the Herald of Ceremonies had become a very lucrative and prestigious yamen. Surrounded by dense cypress trees, the summer heat could not penetrate the yamen at all. Fan Xian sat quietly in the quiet hall, listening to the man above him speak. The speaker was Xan Chiwu, the vice-envoy of the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. Northern Qi and Dongi had come to deliver their letters of credence. To the officials of the Kingdom of Qing who were used to being the boss, this was not a very big deal. So the vice-envoy of the office of the Herald of Ceremonies was still sleeping at home. The person in charge of this matter was only a 4th-rank vice-envoy. Master Fan, this time the court appointed you as the deputy envoy. First, it is because of your talent, and second, the matter of Northern Qi has something to do with you. It is just that you are not familiar with these matters, so there is no need to rush. Take your time. Xan Chiwu knew that the beautiful young man sitting at the very bottom had a powerful background, so he spoke very politely. Yes. Master Fan, your poetry is famous throughout the capital. Coming to our office of the Herald of Ceremonies to reason with those foreigners is a waste of your talent. A large group of officials looked at Fan Xian, quietly flattering him. At the same time, they were afraid that this young master would steal all the credit from the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. They couldn't help but look a little embarrassed. Chapter 123. Fan Xian did not dare to be careless. He quickly stood up and bowed, then cupped his hands in salute. He looked at the diplomatic officials of the Kingdom of Qing with a warm expression and said sincerely, I have only been in Taichung Temple for a few days, and I do not even understand the music of the court. The palace appointed me as deputy, presumably to let the Northern Qi rebels see that the people of the Qing kingdom cannot be casually killed. They only want me to be a memorial. They don't actually want me to do anything during the negotiations. He chuckled and continued, I know nothing about the relations between nations. I only hope that I will not be a hindrance to you. I hope you will not hesitate to enlighten me. After all, he was not someone who had been in the bureaucracy for a long time. Fan Xian's words were a bit excessive and reckless. But this kind of straightforward speech actually made the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies feel very comfortable. Originally, when they learned that Assistant Minister Fan's son was going to participate in the negotiations, these self-proclaimed professionals of the Kingdom of Qing always felt a little uncomfortable. It was like a group of carrion crows, and suddenly a vulture had flown in for a bone. Since Fan Xian had made it clear that he was not here to fight for credit, the people of Honglu Temple were naturally much happier. Xan Chiwu also nodded his head in approval. Of course, everyone knew that if they could successfully demarcate the border, they would be able to obtain a large amount of tribute silver and be rewarded accordingly. This nobleman, who was clearly here to gild his name, would certainly receive what he deserved. After the meeting, Xn Chiwu led Fan Xian to a small room that had been prepared for him. He pointed to a large cabinet filled with documents and said, "The relevant information is all here. The most important thing in this negotiation is that Northern Qi wants to give some silver in exchange for a large piece of land, which we have already occupied. Dongyi does not have any requests. They only want to settle the last 2 assassinations. The first is the Nyolan Street incident related to Fan Xian. The 2 female assassins have already been proven to be the disciples of Sigu Jian's second disciple. The second is the matter of the manor at the foot of Tsang Mountain, but..." He looked at Fan Xian and paused for a moment before continuing, "As you know, that matter is a bit complicated, so the court will not be able to come up with any good evidence." Fan Xian nodded. Smelling the stale air in the room, he began to feel a headache coming on. Would he have to deal with these things for the next few days? As if reading his mind, Vice-Chancellor Xn smiled and said, "If Master Fan does not wish to stay on duty, you may take it home with you. But you are not allowed to take a single step out of the yamen, as long as it is marked in red." Fan Xian was overjoyed. Although he knew that the old man did not want to see him as an eyesore, he still gratefully said, "To tell the truth, I have no idea why I came here today. If you do not mind my laziness, I am willing to sleep at home every day." For a mere 8th-level functionary to make such a joke with a 4th-level vice-minister of Honglu Temple, Fan Xian reckoned he was a rare anomaly in the Qin kingdom. Xan Chiwu paused for a moment before bursting into laughter. He lowered his voice and said, "Master Fan, the Eastern Palace has high hopes for you." Fan Xian smiled. Now that he knew who Xan Chiwu was, he did not dare to be vague. He quickly replied, "Please do not worry, sir. I understand. My father often teaches his sons that as an official, I must abide by the rules of an official." Hearing this reply, Xan Chiwu, who was the crown prince's confidant, nodded with satisfaction. "Count Sinan is devoted to the country. I have always admired him." The 2 of them exchanged a few more indifferent words before Vice-Chancellor Xn left. Fan Xian watched him leave and gradually narrowed his eyes. His father had indeed said that as long as the crown prince was on the throne, the Fan family would naturally be loyal to the crown prince. But even Fan Xian himself did not believe these words. Xan Chiwu, who was clearly a member of the Eastern Palace, would not believe it so easily. Appointing Fan Xian as deputy envoy was only a cautious attempt by the Eastern Palace to see if the Fan family could move a little closer to the crown prince's throne, even if it was just a little. In the following dozen days, Fan Xian did as he said. Every day he shut himself in the manor and slept. Of course, for him, sleeping itself was a necessary process of cultivation. As for the official matters, after he took back some information, he handed it over to Wang Qinian and let him make the decision to come up with a proper negotiation plan. Fan Xian knew very well that Wang Qinian would secretly report to the old cripple of the Overwatch Council. Since that was the case, he handed over this complicated and boring task to Wang Qinian. Whether it was for the sake of his mother or his father, Qin Pingping could not allow Fan Xian to lose face in court. Of course he would handle it appropriately. When it came to using resources that he could use, he did not hold back. As expected, a few days later, Wang Qinian came to the small room they had agreed upon, looking haggard. He handed over a thick folder. Fan Xian curiously opened it and his eyes lit up. He saw that it was divided into 2 parts. One was the internal reference material that only the high-ranking officials of the Office of the Grand Herald were allowed to see, and the other was the prepared file on the negotiations with Northern Qi. The material clearly analyzed the internal situation of Northern Qi, including the scheming between the young emperor and the Empress Dowager, Imperial Advisor Ku He being a pacifist, and so on. The material clearly stated that the Empress Dowager's younger brother, the Marquis of Ning, had been attacked by the civil officials of Northern Qi because of his defeat. Thus, the young emperor did not care how much money he had to pay or how much land he had to cut off. As long as the people were angry, he could use this opportunity to weaken the power of the Empress Dowager. Because the Empress Dowager was anxious to calm things down and free up her hands to reorganize the court, her instructions for this negotiation were mainly to be patient. Of course, these things hidden in the dark could not be seen by the foreign officials of the Qin kingdom. Only the secret power of the Overwatch Council, through spies all over Northern Qi, could find out every little thing, and then put them together and analyze them, could come to such a clear conclusion. Wonderful. Fan Xian sighed. With this information in hand, the officials of the Office of the Grand Herald will be laughing their heads off. He paused, then asked curiously, How reliable is this information? The corners of Wang Qinyan's eyes drooped. It seemed that he had not slept well for the past few days. Very reliable. Yan Bingyun has already made a name for himself in northern Qi, and the entire intelligence network is very reasonable. With mutual reference there should be no problem. Fan Xian could not help but feel some respect for the young man called Yan Bingyun. For the sake of the country, he was content to be a rat in the shadows, and he had done so for many years. As the son of a high-ranking official in the court, it was not easy. How could he know that the reason Yan Bingyun was pitifully staying in northern Qi was because of the attempted assassination when Fan Xian was 12 years old? If Fan Xian knew about this, he did not know whether he would feel guilty or laugh out loud. Wang Qinian, I didn't expect you to be so good at intelligence analysis as well as tracking. Fan Xian knew exactly where this dossier had come from, but he did not point it out. Wang Qinian could only return the courtesy, not daring to claim credit. Fine, I'll go to the office of the Grand Herald tomorrow and discuss this with the Vice Minister. Fan Xian saw that Wang Qinian seemed to want to say something and asked curiously, is there anything else? Wang Qinian said awkwardly, Sir, this information cannot be given to the office of the Grand Herald. What? Because, the secrets involved are of the highest level. The entire office of the Grand Herald, including the Minister of the Grand Herald, has no right to access them. Fan Xian slapped his forehead and laughed bitterly. Then what do you think we should do? Let the council go through normal channels and give it directly to the office of the Grand Herald. Wang Qinian sighed. If it were not for the fact that the director wanted Fan Xian to astonish everyone in the negotiations and pave the way for his future career, he would not have ordered the entire 6th Bureau to work through the night to write this dossier. This dossier looked ordinary, but it contained the blood, sweat and tears of the Overwatch Council's intelligence analysts. If Fan Xian were to simply give it to the office of the Grand Herald, the director would probably jump out of his wheelchair in anger. It was the end of summer and the heat was still hot. The people on the streets of the capital and the black dogs on the streets were somewhat dispirited by the weather. On the 8th day of the 8th month, an auspicious day, the northern Qi and Dongyi envoys arrived at the last official resting place to the northwest of the capital. The Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing had personally issued an edict allowing the two envoys to stay in the Emperor's palace. The protocol officials of the three sides argued for a few days, and finally decided on a schedule and arrangements for their arrival in the capital. The people of the capital were all roused. They felt that in their ordinary and boring lives, there had suddenly been an autumn rain. In their minds, the envoys of these two countries were not here to negotiate, but to present their letters of surrender. As the deputy envoy for negotiations, Fan Xian was naturally part of the group that welcomed the envoys. From the west gate of the capital, he waited for the officials of the two countries, and arranged for them to stay in the official resting place. The faces of the northern Qi envoys were clearly unsightly. After all, they had been the losers in this battle of commanding the vassal states. Furthermore, many of their soldiers had been captured and most importantly, a lot of their land had been occupied. Sir, who is this? The highest-ranking official in the northern Qi envoys was the younger brother of the current empress, Chang Ningho. He looked down at the handsome young man from above, and his heart was filled with anger. The kingdom of Qing did not value him. The official receiving him was only a minor official from the office of the Grand Herald, and yet they had allowed such a young man to be the deputy envoy. It could not be helped that they were looking down on him. I am Fan Xian. Greetings, Master Marquis. Fan Xian's face was full of smiles as he looked at the enemy. The intelligence report from the Overwatch Council in his bosom made it clear that this man was just a decoration. The man in the sedan behind him, Zhuang Mohan, was the real deal. He had been arranged by the palace to live in a side courtyard. Fan Ruoruo said shyly, as a brother, how can you not be serious? Fan Xian laughed and said, if you really like that old man, then you are the one who is not proper. Seeing that Ruoruo was about to get angry, he quickly waved his hand and said, let's be serious. Do you have any ideas about what I told you that day at the country estate? That night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The brother and sister were sitting in the field worrying about the little girl's future marriage. Ruoruo fretted for a while, but in the end, not a single one of the four young talents caught her eye, so she gave up. At that moment, Fan Xian thought of something and frowned. Last time, when we coincidentally met His Majesty at the Lujing River, didn't he say something? What did he say? Fan Ruoruo showed a rare confused expression. It seemed that the brother and sister were too shocked at the time, and their memories were a little fuzzy. Fan Xian closed his eyes for a long time. Suddenly he opened them and slapped the table. His Majesty wants to arrange a marriage for you. Ah. Fan Ruorwo was quite frightened. What were the children of officials most afraid of? Marriage. If they were lucky like Lin Wan they would be married to Fan Xian. If they were like Taichung Temple's Ren Xiaoqin, who was married to a tigress princess, they would not be happy for the rest of their lives. And of all the marriage arrangements, the most frightening was the one that came from the palace. The emperor's will could not be disobeyed. Even if you were to marry a hedonistic son of a rich family, you would not be able to reason with him. In the past, officials and eunuchs still had the possibility of sending their daughters to the palace to win the emperor's favor. But this emperor was not interested in women, so this path was blocked. Even the crown prince and the 2 adult princes did not dare to take more than 1 concubine. Although the crown prince's lecherous reputation was known throughout the capital, there were only 3 cold and lonely concubines in the eastern palace. Fan Ruorwo also remembered the emperor's seemingly unintentional words. She was quite shocked and tears welled up in her eyes. What should we do? She asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian's mind worked quickly, and he immediately came up with a few possible families. He narrowed his eyes and said, the great prince, the second prince, and the crown prince of King Jing. Although my father is only an assistant minister, based on the Fan family's position, the emperor will probably only choose one of these 3. If he chooses one of the minister's sons, then there is nothing to be afraid of. If you are not willing, I naturally have a way to reject this marriage. If the marriage was to be arranged to the son of a minister, and his sister was not willing, Fan Xian would naturally think of many ways. After all, behind him stood his father, Qin Pingping, and the prime minister. They were the so-called 3 powerful people, and even the crown prince of the eastern palace was trying to rope him in. As long as it was not one of the 2 princes or crown prince Jing, Fan Xian was confident that he could ruin all the marriages his sister did not want. However, the 3 young nobles were most likely to be the ones who were the most powerful. Fan Xian was quiet for a moment, and then suddenly couldn't help but curse. I was wondering why Li Hongqing went to the brothel every day but refused to get married. So he was waiting here. Seeing his sister's frightened expression, Fan Xian smiled and comforted her. The eldest prince has been fighting in the Western barbarians for many years, and I hear he is also outstanding in martial arts. Although I have never met the second prince, I hear he is also a very powerful person. As for Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, the 2 of us are familiar with each other. Aside from his somewhat playful nature, there is nothing bad about him. If you really do marry Li Hongqing with me on your side, I won't even let him take a concubine into his room, let alone a brothel. Don't worry, sister. It would have been better if he hadn't comforted her. Now that he had analyzed the situation, Ruorwo felt more and more certain that it was true, as if it was about to happen. She said sorrowfully, brother, but I don't want to marry any of these 3. Fan Xian sighed. He didn't want to continue discussing the troubles of growing up. In a gentle voice he teased, what's so bad about that? When I see you in the future, I'll have to call you a concubine or something. If the second prince really does become emperor, and you're the mother of the world, wouldn't that make you my mother? This joke was not very funny, so Ruorwo didn't laugh through her tears. There was an awkward silence in the study. In the silence, the brother and sister both had their own worries. Ruorwo was confused, while Fan Xian was determined. If something really did happen in the future, he had to prepare for it. The location for the negotiations was not very spacious. It was set up in the largest room in Honglu Temple. There was no extremely long table between the Northern Qi envoy and the Qing official. Instead, it was as if they were having a casual chat. They sat in their respective chairs, with tea on the table, and chatted as if they were having a casual conversation. Fan Xian insisted on sitting in the most inconspicuous chair at the bottom. He looked at the scene with cold eyes and thought of a phrase from his previous life, tea party. Although he was nominally the deputy envoy because the process had not yet entered the final stage, and he insisted on sitting below, the official from Honglu Temple couldn't do anything. Under the gentle exchange of words, there was a hidden glint of swords. Before long, the voices of the officials of the 2 countries, who had already seen the outcome of the battle, gradually grew louder. Some of the more impatient officials' buttocks were about to leave the surface of their chairs. I don't know whether Northern Qi won this battle on the northern border, or our court won. A 6th-level official registrar of the Honglu Temple could no longer tolerate the other party's unreasonable words. He stood up and sternly rebuked them. Battles are dangerous. His Majesty of Northern Qi is worried about his subjects and people, and so he benevolently and righteously stopped the battle. Victory and defeat have not been decided, so how can we know who the winner is? If the envoy of Northern Qi was not thick-skinned, he would not have been sent to be the vanguard. Seeing the mustached man speak as if it were a matter of course, even the usually calm Fan Xian wanted to rush forward and beat him up. Xan Chiwu of the Honglu Temple smiled slightly, but Fan Xian could see a trace of treachery in his smile. This treachery was the confidence that the Qin kingdom had accumulated through 20 years of victories. He heard the high-ranking official of the Qin kingdom say quietly, "In that case, please return. Between our two countries we will fight again. After a true victory has been decided, it will not be too late to negotiate." What was this? This was an undisguised threat. This was undisguised state terrorism. This was undisguised hooliganism. Fan Xian did not show any shock on his face, but in his heart he was incomparably impressed. This Xan Chiwu is quite daring. As expected, as soon as he said this, the Northern Qi side began to attack the Qing officials for speaking carelessly, causing irreparable damage to the friendship between the two countries. Unexpectedly, Xan Chiwu continued to coldly reply, "Between our two countries, when has there ever been such a thing as friendship? This is probably how Wei Xiaobao negotiates." Fan Xian clicked his tongue in his heart. A high-ranking official of the Honglu Temple was acting like a scoundrel in the relationship between the two countries. If it were not for the fact that the kingdom of Qin was truly powerful, this situation would never have occurred. The negotiations of the Honglu Temple had always been well coordinated. The red-faced and black-faced officials took turns to take the stage, and as expected, another official stood up with a face full of benevolence. "Everyone, do not forget your duties. Do not let your emotions affect His Majesty's original intention of restoring the friendship between our two countries." The two sides brushed their sleeves and left, and the tea party ended. The high-ranking officials had already revealed their identities, and the actual fighting at the negotiating table was left to the lower-ranking officials, who worked hard to do it. But the negotiations had reached an impasse, and for the time being they could not move forward. As for the Northern Qi envoy Zhuang Mohan, after entering the palace to speak with the Empress Dowager, he rarely came out to see people. Fan Xian was a little puzzled. Was that old man here on vacation? Chapter 125. 2 days later, in the office of the Grand Herald. Exchanging captives is the first major event. Xan Chiwu was no longer as reckless as when the two countries were negotiating. He said lightly, "His Majesty has decreed that the captured soldiers must be returned no matter what. Everything else is trivial. We might as well make some concessions in this regard." An official replied, "The number of people captured from Northern Qi and the small countries they control has been roughly tallied. There are more than 2,400 people. On our side, about 1,000 people were captured. According to His Majesty's decree, even if we were to exchange our captives, we would still be able to get them back." "Yes." Xan Chiwu nodded, satisfied with his subordinate's efficiency. Regarding the issue of redrawing the border, His Majesty's intentions are clear. We will not give up an inch of the land we have taken. If Northern Qi wants it, they will have to exchange it with the grasslands of Qianlong Bay. Qianlong Bay was in the northwest of the Kingdom of Qing, and it was connected to the only enclave of the Kingdom of Qing there. If they could take it back, that enclave would be safe. The officials noted down their superiors' intentions. One of them said, "But for some reason, Northern Qi has been particularly unyielding this time. It seems they want to fight to the death. They have only agreed to give us money and horses, but they are not willing to cede the land." The first person to jump out at the tea party was an impulsive person. He slammed the table and scolded, "We have already taken the land. Are we going to have to give it back?" Xan Chiwu nodded. Although Master Zhao's words are a bit direct, they do make sense. He coldly glanced at his subordinates, put down the teacup in his hand and said, "My fellow colleagues, don't forget that these lands were won by our soldiers with swords and spears. They were exchanged with blood and flesh. Of course we can't give them back with both hands. Those soldiers have paid with their lives. What about us? We are only moving our lips, so we cannot give up on the interests of our own countries. We must fight with them for a tael of silver and an inch of land." The man who had spoken earlier continued to frown. "What you say is very true, sir. But according to the secret reports from the envoy stationed in Shangjing, the relationship between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi has become warmer because of this defeat. Furthermore, the Empress Dowager's brother has already been punished and returned home. If we ask for too much in the negotiations and the two countries go to war again after a breakdown, this would not be in line with His Majesty's wishes. Everyone should know that if Northern Qi is truly of one mind, even a centipede with 100 legs would not feel good if it bit someone. Shangjing of Northern Qi is too far away. Going there and back, this information might not be useful. Xan Chiwu felt a headache coming on. The most important thing in negotiations was to know yourself and your enemy. Although they had the home advantage and the advantage of being the victor, the other side was in their own capital. They could rely on the Northern Qi spy network that the court had not yet had time to clean up. They could have first-hand information on the Qing court's reaction, but it would be difficult for the Qing side to know the true reaction of the Northern Qi court. Someone suggested, "Why don't we ask His Majesty to have the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council assist us? You should know that the people of the 4th Bureau in Northern Qi are much more powerful than those of the other yamens of the court." Everyone's eyes brightened. This was true. As officials of the capital, of course they feared and hated the Overwatch Council. But if the mad dog, the Overwatch Council, was used to deal with the enemy, no one would object. They would all be in favor of it. Unexpectedly, hearing this suggestion, Xan Chiwu suddenly lost his poise. He scolded, "What you have thought of, haven't I and the prefect not thought of it? If Yen Luo Dian doesn't want to give us anything, what can I do? Do I have to go cry in front of His Majesty's palace?" So that was how it was. Their faces became calm again, but deep down they thought, if you can get information on Northern Qi, what is there to be afraid of crying on the stone steps in front of Xingqing Palace? The hall fell silent. Although the officials and people of the Qing kingdom had always thought of themselves as the strongest country in the world, before His Majesty ascended the throne, the people of the Qing kingdom had always lived under the terrifying shadow of Northern Wei. Although Northern Wei had been reduced to half of its territory by His Majesty on 3 northern expeditions, becoming the Northern Qi of today, if they were forced into a corner again, it would still be a terrifying thing. So without the support of strong confidence, the negotiations seemed to be stuck in a stalemate. "Tonight, I will go to the palace again to ask for His Majesty's decree." Xan Chiwu frowned, but his eyes glanced at Fan Xian, who had been sitting quietly at the end. Fan Xian seemed to have no self-awareness as a deputy. These days, whether it was negotiations or anything else, he always sat there with a smile on his face. No one knew what he was thinking. Xan Chiwu had been sent here by the Crown Prince's edict to give Fan Xian some political capital. Fan Xian was sensible enough not to take credit, but it was not good for him to be so silent. He thought for a moment, then said gently, "Master Fan, what do you think of this?" Fan Xian clenched his fists in his sleeves, but his face remained calm. He said gently, "I think that Northern Qi is just bluffing. If they really have the strength to fight again, they would not be in such a hurry to send a diplomatic mission to sue for peace." The officials all knew that Master Fan was famous for his poetry and fists, and they had admired his quiet and unambitious attitude these days, so they had some expectations of what he would say. But when they found out that he could only say such a general statement, they could not help but feel disappointed. But for the sake of face, the officials could not say anything, so they casually agreed. Xan Chiwu, on the other hand, thought that since he was going to do Fan Xian a favor, he might as well do it thoroughly. He continued to ask gently, "What you say is reasonable. But in the relationship between two countries, what is real is fake and what is fake is real. A country is like a person, and sometimes it is dominated by emotions, so it cannot be judged by reason. Do you have any other evidence, Deputy Fan?" He really did hope that Fan Xian could strengthen the conviction of the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. Fan Xian inwardly praised the Vice Minister for saying that a country is like a person. He thought for a moment, then said, "The key is that Zhuang Mohan. You all know his position in the hearts of the world's scholars. If Northern Qi did not intend to sue for peace, they would not have spent so much to invite Zhuang Mohan to the capital with the diplomatic mission." The officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies all came from the imperial examinations, so of course they knew of Zhuang Mohan's name. After a moment's thought, they realized that this was indeed the case. But this alone was not enough to bring the negotiations back to the original path. Xan Chiwu frowned. If we could find out why Zhuang Mohan was willing to come, perhaps it would be of some help. The Overwatch Council's files clearly stated that Zhuang Mohan was willing to come because, first, the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi had lowered themselves to beg him. Second, Zhuang Mohan had always prided himself as a mortal saint, and wanted to mediate the military conflict between the two countries. The third reason seemed to be his personal reasons, which had not yet been discovered. Although Fan Xian despised the attitude of this saint, he would not belittle his reputation. But at this moment he would not reveal these reasons in front of all the officials. He only replied quietly, If we could meet him, perhaps we would be able to find some clues. Registrar Xiao shook his head and said somewhat helplessly, according to the customs of the two countries, such a person is usually only seen at banquets in front of the palace. If an official of the Chamberlain of Dependencies asks for an audience, and he refuses, there is nothing we can do. We would only be humiliating ourselves. Suddenly his eyes brightened. But Deputy Fan's reputation for poetry has long been known throughout the world. I believe that Zhuang Mohan would not refuse the title of meeting friends through poetry. Fan Xian was surprised. He had only copied 3 poems and 2 of them had been written by Ruoruo. How could he make his reputation known throughout the world? Fortunately, Xan Chiwu shook his head and helped him out. Zhuang Mohan has always been an extremely arrogant person. His scholarly works, poetry and songs are all the top talents of the world. There is no way he would lower himself to meet Deputy Fan. In my opinion, the key to Northern Qi's invitation this time is the banquet in front of the palace. They want to use his reputation to persuade His Majesty. The officials thought that this was probably the case. After the meeting was over, Fan Xian found an opportunity to pull Xan Chiwu aside and hand over the proposal that he and Ruoruo had spent several nights organizing. Xan Chiwu flipped through it hastily and his eyes brightened. He had not expected Fan Xian to write something like this. Although the evidence was rather absurd, after careful analysis, it seemed to point directly at the current situation in Northern Qi. Good. Xan Chiwu said excitedly. With this, the office of the Grand Herald will have more confidence in our negotiations. But, Deputy Fan, why did you not mention it before and now you are giving it to me in private? Fan Xian looked at his superior's suspicious expression and smiled. Some of the deductions are a bit absurd. These are my personal opinions, so I did not dare say them in public. I am only giving them to you in private for your consideration. Xan Chiwu could not contain his excitement. He stood in the corridor and read carefully, but his brow gradually furrowed. After a long time he said quietly, Master Fan, there are many things in here that even the court does not know about. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that he could not hide it from Xan Chiwu, but he had trained his composure for over 10 years. Ever since he arrived in the capital. His expression did not change. He smiled. There are some things that I cannot say. One of the most important things about being an official was to pretend to be mysterious. As expected, Xan Chiwu did not pursue the matter. Instead he smiled warmly. If this negotiation is successful, I will certainly write to His Majesty and guarantee you a great service. Fan Xian smiled, bowed and excused himself. Xan Chiwu watched Fan Xian's green-robed silhouette disappear into the courtyard, and a look of confusion appeared on his face. He was close to the crown prince, and naturally knew that Count Sinan held a private power that belonged to His Majesty. But this power had never been displayed on the political stage of the Kingdom of Qin. Could it be that Fan Xian dared to use it just because of Fan Xian? He had never connected Fan Xian to the Overwatch Council. After all, the Overwatch Council was His Majesty's private spy agency. Even the princes could not interfere, much less the illegitimate son of an official. Sitting in the sedan chair, Xan Chiwu rested his chin on his hand and pondered. After the sedan chair stopped, he looked at the tall red palace wall outside. It seemed that his advice to the crown prince had been correct. As for the Fan family, they could only be roped in, not attacked. Chapter 126. Within the Eastern Palace, there were 2 factions of opinion. The faction that opposed Xan Chiwu believed that since the Fan family of Count Sinan had a good relationship with King Jing, and now had a marriage alliance with the Prime Minister, Crown Prince Jing was a close friend of the second prince, and the Prime Minister was gradually distancing himself from the Eastern Palace, the Fan family must be on the second prince's side. Xan Chiwu firmly opposed this view, because in his view, Fan Jian was not an ordinary official who would follow the Prime Minister's lead. In the depths of the palace, Xan Chiwu obediently knelt in the doorway of the study, his buttocks raised high. Fortunately, his official robes covered it so it did not look ugly. Rise. The emperor's voice came from behind the curtains. Xan Chiwu stood up, his arms hanging by his side, not daring to move. He had been to this study a few times, but he still could not get used to the natural pressure. 2 soybean-sized beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. He did not know if it was because of the summer heat or because he was nervous, but he did not dare to wipe them away. The sound of paper flipping rang out from behind the curtains. After a long silence, the emperor lightly said, "This statement is reasonable and well-founded." "Very good," Since that mother in the north is still not willing to settle down, then that's good. You have to help me open my mouth wider. Xan Chiwu replied loudly, Yes, Your Majesty. The emperor's voice suddenly became strange. Assistant Minister Fan's son is now your deputy? Xan Chiwu did not expect His Majesty to be so concerned about Fan Jian. A few more beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, and he respectfully replied, Yes. The emperor seemed to be very interested in this matter. Oh, this Fan Xian, I made him a functionary in Taichung Temple. Why did you want to transfer him to Honglu Temple? Although His Majesty's voice was still gentle, Xan Chiwu was so nervous that he almost fainted. He did not dare to hide anything and answered honestly, A few days ago Your Majesty ordered me to lecture in the Eastern Palace, and I spoke with the Crown Prince about the Northern Qi envoy. Because Fan Xian is related to this matter, and because he is famous in the capital, the Northern Qi envoy has Zhuang Mohan, and the court needs a scholar to receive him. So I ventured to suggest this and Your Majesty agreed. Yes. Behind the curtain, the emperor admired this official's frank attitude. He had never been afraid of people forming cliques in the court, but this clique had to be formed in the open. If there is no mistake in this matter, I will give you full authority to handle this matter. Even if it is the Crown Prince, you do not need to ask. Yes. Xan Chiwu had never thought of hiding his relationship with the Crown Prince from His Majesty. After all, he was the person appointed by His Majesty to serve in the Eastern Palace. The emperor flipped through the file again, faintly frowning. How did Fan Xian do? Xan Chiwu did not dare to be greedy and replied honestly, The dossier that Your Majesty is looking at is the result of Deputy Fan's analysis. Analysis? For some reason, the emperor's tone became a little angry. This is getting more and more ridiculous. Xan Chiwu did not know why His Majesty was angry and was terrified. Fortunately, this matter did not seem to have much to do with the negotiation. After he left the study, His Majesty lifted the curtain and walked out. On his face there was a trace of anger, but also a trace of helplessness. He ordered the eunuch beside him, Summon Qin Pingping to the palace. The eunuch accepted the order and left. The master of the kingdom of Qing, the most powerful man in the world, walked out of his study and stood in the hallway of the palace. He looked at the dim moon and the corners of his lips curled up. He said to himself, The most powerful weapon of the nation, and instead of directly assisting the office of the Grand Herald, you use it as a stepping stone for a child's advancement. Well done, Qin Pingping. It looks like if I don't teach you a lesson, you really will give my courtyard to that child to play with. What kind of person was the emperor? From the file that claimed to be the result of Fan Xian's analysis, he could immediately see the shadow of the Overwatch Council. But looking at his expression, he did not seem to be angry, only a little amused. Xan Chiwu's attempt to have the Crown Prince win over the Fan family was actually in line with the emperor's thoughts. The Eastern Palace had finally shown some political wisdom, and the Crown Prince seemed to have improved. This fact made the emperor feel slightly gratified. In the Eastern Palace, a fierce quarrel had broken out. The two sides of the quarrel were Xan Chiwu from the office of the Grand Herald and Guo Baoquan, the of the palace. The content of the quarrel was naturally related to the 8th-level official called Fan Xian. Looking at the red faces of both sides, it was obvious how intense the quarrel had been. Xan Chiwu looked at Guo Baoquan with a hint of disdain. As an official, I have to be frank. I have come to assist the Crown Prince on His Majesty's orders, in order to help the Crown Prince plan for 1,000 years, and to choose a good talent. Functionary Fan Xian has a reputation for talent in the capital. Looking at his recent actions, he knows when to advance and when to retreat. He has real talent, and the Fan family has always been a loyal subject of the royal family. Of course, the Crown Prince should condescend to accept such an official, and not turn him away just because of a moment's anger. Guo Baoquan sneered, Does Lord Shaoqing think that I only remember that punch? Don't forget the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's Manor, and that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Don't you know the Prime Minister's direction? Xan Chiwu straightened his neck and said, I don't know. I only know that the kingdom of Qing only has one emperor, and the kingdom of Qing only has one crown prince. Any attempt to divide the kingdom into factions is extremely foolish. He was not a man with only great ambitions but no skills. Of course, he knew that the second prince had recently become popular, but in terms of strategy, he still believed that the Eastern Palace did not need to treat the second prince as an opponent. Once that happened, it would open a dangerous door. As long as the Crown Prince remained upright and righteous, there would be no enemies to speak of. The Crown Prince, who was sitting high above, sighed. He was indeed lecherous and cowardly, but he was not an idiot. In the depths of his heart, he knew that if he looked at the bigger picture, Xan Shaoqing's view was undoubtedly correct. But politics had always been a battle to the death. Even if he was careful, who could guarantee that his two brothers who were eyeing the throne would not do something? The situation at hand has not reached that point. The crown prince rubbed his temples and said with some annoyance, "After all, I am the heir to the throne. It is my duty to reserve talents for the court. As for my brother, don't talk nonsense. That would be too absurd." This was the helplessness of the royal palace. It was clear that they were on guard against each other, but no one could say anything verbally. What about Fan Xian? Guo Baoquan still did not want to give up. Xan Chiwu snorted and said, "Master Guo, I think you have been misjudging one thing." "What is it?" the crown prince asked curiously. "Many officials, including you, have put the Fan family under the second prince's faction because of the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's manor. But who can prove this? This edict from the Eastern Palace has given Fan Xian a chance to shine. If the Fan family is really as Master Guo says, I'm afraid they would not dare accept this mission." Xan Chiwu continued coldly, "The most important thing is that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Master Guo's judgment that Fan Xian will not be loyal to the Crown Prince is absurd." "What's absurd about it?" Guo Baoquan's eyes flashed with viciousness. "Whether it's in court or in secret, it all shows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess and is trying to break away from the palace's influence. As the Prime Minister of a country, he should not be controlled by the people in the palace." Xan Chiwu came to his senses and bowed to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince shook his head indifferently and signaled for him to continue. Xan Chiwu continued, "What Master Guo said earlier is where the problem lies. Everyone knows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess. But what does this have to do with the Eastern Palace? Does this mean that the Prime Minister is no longer loyal to His Majesty? Is he no longer on His Highness's side?" The Crown Prince frowned. "But, my aunt has been very angry with the Prime Minister lately. Your Highness, forgive me for being presumptuous, but you cannot change your attitude towards the Prime Minister because of the eldest princess's attitude." Xan Chiwu was neither servile nor overbearing. The Crown Prince's frown deepened. "But," he wanted to say something but stopped. Guo Baoquan took this opportunity to speak coldly. "But if the Prime Minister is still the same as before, why hasn't he come to the Eastern Palace to pay his respects after the recent court meetings?" Xan Chiwu smiled confidently and replied, "I did not deny that. Your Highness, this is only an arrangement. It is far from a competition of strength between the two sides. Truly intelligent officials will naturally stick closely to His Majesty. This is enough to ensure the longevity of their families. The Prime Minister is the same. He may be wavering between the Crown Prince and the Second Prince, but in the end, he will still listen to His Majesty's orders. If we want the Prime Minister to truly stand on our side." He took a deep breath. "The key lies in Fan Xian. The Prime Minister no longer has a true son. Fan Xian is the future of the Lin family. If we can get Fan Xian to pledge allegiance to your Highness, the Prime Minister's attitude will naturally change." Guo Baoquan snorted. "Don't forget the relationship between Crown Prince Jing and Fan Xian. And don't forget who worked for the person we found out a few days ago," Xan Chiwu said coldly. "That person deliberately let Fan Xian and your Highness run into each other. Naturally, he hoped that your Highness would remember the grudge from a few days ago and humiliate Fan Xian so that Fan Xian would truly join his side. Fortunately, your Highness is wise. Naturally, you will not fall for such a despicable person's trick." The Crown Prince smiled warmly, somewhat pleased. If the Fan family is really on his side, why would he need to use such a trick? Xan Chiwu continued, "I believe that with the Fan family's power, they will certainly find out the truth behind this matter. If they do find out that person did it, I fear that Fan Xian will bear a grudge. So we do not need to worry about the Fan family's current attitude." The Crown Prince was somewhat moved. He said softly, "If the Fan family is still in the dark and has fallen for that person's trick, I might as well tell them. Taking in Fan Xian is the same as taking in the Fan family and the Lin family. The two great powers in the capital, the civil officials and the nobles, at least half of the people look to these two families. And in a few years, I'm afraid that even the palace treasury will be managed by this young man." Xan Chiwu said softly to the Crown Prince, "An 8th-rank official can bring more than a few poems to the people of the capital." Chapter 127. The crown prince was moved. After a while he finally made up his mind. He slapped the desk and said, "Very well, I will give Fan Xian a chance. I hope he will not disappoint me." The Eastern Palace's plan was set. Guo Baoquan was sad, Xan Chiwu was excited, and the crown prince felt that he was wise and tolerant. But none of them knew that the empress and eldest princess had once tried to assassinate Fan Xian. The true power behind the Eastern Palace had already clashed with Fan Xian twice, once in Danzhou and once in Yolan Street and at the foot of Tsang Mountain. Of course, they had no way of knowing that a few years later, things would become so absurd and inconceivable. The night in the royal palace was always more distant and dark than in other places. It hid all the truth in the past, and made it impossible to see what kind of face would appear in the near future. With the Overwatch Council's intelligence as their backing, the negotiations over the next few days suddenly changed. Northern Qi still wanted to use the sticky candy tactic to drag things out day by day, hoping to wear down the patience of the Qing court. Who would have thought that the powerful vice minister of the Honglu Temple, Xan Chiwu, would become even more ferocious over the past 2 days at the negotiation table? His aura had transformed into a mountain-splitting axe, chopping down on the other party again and again. After 3 rounds of negotiations, issues such as the exchange of prisoners, tribute and titles were all resolved. All that was left was the difficult bone to chew, the redrawing of the borders between the vassal states. As the assistant envoy, Fan Xian watched the entire process with cold eyes. He greatly admired Xan Shaoqing's knowledge and charisma. He had not expected the crown prince to be surrounded by more than just ordinary people. Not everyone in the Eastern Palace was as annoying as Guo Baoquan. Xan Chiwu, in his free time during the negotiations, also had time to communicate with Fan Xian or observe him in secret. He was surprised that Fan Xian, so young, was able to maintain his composure. He increasingly felt that he could not see through this young nobleman. Overall, the negotiations went smoothly. Aside from the Overwatch Council's help in compiling the dossier, Fan Xian did not do much. But in the future, when it came to rewards, he would always be missing a share, so Fan Xian was very satisfied with his current life. The bookstore was managed by Qingyu Hall's 7th Yi shopkeeper, and Fan Xizha often worked as an accountant, so there was no need for him to worry about it. Naturally, the women of the Lin and Fan manors were busy preparing for the wedding in 2 months. Even Lady Lu was very happy with the fact that Fan Xian was going to be the fake son-in-law. She played the role of a stepmother and was very busy. After all, if he married the emperor's adopted daughter, Fan Xian would probably not inherit the title of nobility. Furthermore, Lin Wanner had another identity. The old spinsters in the palace often came to the manor to make irresponsible remarks. Every few days, there would be an edict from one of the concubines, causing Count Sinan and Fan Jian to be badly battered. For Fan Xian, who had no understanding of the etiquette of the palace, these things were naturally avoided as much as possible. It was just that Lin Wanner and Ruoruo, who were helping their brother carry the ceremony, had to spend every day immersed in this pain. The second prince had asked Crown Prince Jing to speak on his behalf twice, wanting to invite Fan Xian for a meeting. But the encounter with the Crown Prince during the summer vacation had left a shadow in Fan Xian's heart, so he pushed it back to the end of the month, hoping that things would have calmed down by then. After all, it seemed that the Eastern Palace's attitude toward Fan Manor had changed. It wasn't that he dared to refuse the prince's invitation, but that he had used a good name. When he was working for the country, he dared not linger in Flower Alley. During these days, the only thing that worried him was Zhuang Mohan of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission, who had been living in seclusion, and Sigu Jian's first disciple of the Dongyi diplomatic mission. Of these two, one was a scholar and the other a warrior. Both were top figures in the world. It was a bit too quiet in the capital. Zhuang Mohan had been invited by the Empress Dowager to stay in the palace to give lectures, while Sigu Jian's head disciple, Yun Jilan, had remained with the diplomatic mission. Fan Xian paid the most attention to Yun Jilan. After all, Zhuang Mohan's reputation as a scholar did not conflict with Fan Xian's, while Yun Jilan had taken his life. But in the capital of the kingdom of Qing, Fan Xian believed that Yun Jilan would not be so stupid as to seek vengeance on him alone. So what really bothered Fan Xian was a key. At night, he stared at the black leather case in a daze. The lock looked to be made of brass, but he had tried it before. Even the slender dagger that Fei Jia had left behind could not make a mark on it. It seemed that the material was strange. Behind the brass keyhole, there seemed to be some sort of mechanism, but if he could not obtain the key, he would not even be able to see what the mechanism looked like. Fan Xian had once tried to find some way to get to know Eunuch Hong of the palace, but after a few attempts he realized something. Although he seemed to be doing very well in the capital, there was still a long way to go before he reached the top of the world. The crown prince and the second prince wanted to rope him in because of the Fan and Lin manners behind him. It was not because of anything special about him and the area around the palace, because he did not need to look at the officials. He had no way of getting in touch with them. It was also not convenient for Wanner to enter the palace often, so there was no one who could help him. Even if he wanted to get to know Hong Xixiang, it would be difficult, not to mention that he had to do as Uncle Wu Zhu said and keep him outside the palace for 2 hours. When the second prince used Crown Prince Li Hongqing to invite Fan Xian, he had cleverly used the mouths of others to see if he could get to know Eunuch Hong, but Li Hongqing shook his head. That old dog would only lie in the shade of the Empress Dowager's palace, and would never leave the palace. It looks like I have to change my plan. With a thud, Fan Xian kicked the case back onto the bed. Looking at Wu Zhu, who seemed to be asleep in the corner, he said, I have no way of dragging Eunuch Hong out. Wu Zhu slowly raised his head. I can lure him out, or you can try to find the key in the palace. Fan Xian was shocked. With his average ability of between the 4th level and the 6th level, did he want to die in the palace? But he narrowed his eyes and felt that this seemed to be a more feasible path. Uncle Wu Zhu always said that his power was only at the 3rd level, but he was able to kill Qing Jushu. It seemed that Wu Zhu's calculation ability was too strong, and so he underestimated his ability to use Jinqi. Of course, this was not something Fan Xian could say. If it really is too dangerous, why do I need this key? This was a question that had been lingering in Fan Xian's mind for a long time. If it's just out of curiosity, it doesn't seem worth it to take such a big risk. Don't you want to know what the lady left for you? I do. Fan Xian sat on the bed, his head slightly lowered. But I think that mother must want me to be happy, safe, and live happily in this world. If she put her son in danger because she wanted to know what she left for him, perhaps mother would not want it. Wu Zhu also lowered his head, the black cloth covering his eyes blending into the darkness around him. Although he was not looking at Fan Xian still felt a chill. You are very satisfied with your current life. Wu Zhu's voice was very cold. As always, he rarely asked questions. He was just calmly stating a fact. Fan Xian was startled. After he entered the capital, especially in the period after summer, he seemed to really enjoy the power, wealth, and stability that came with being the son of a noble family. But you cannot control your own life. Wu Zhu continued speaking coldly. Everything before you is constructed according to the plans of Qin Pingping and Fan Jian. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He understood what Wu Zhu meant. But even though he had lived 2 lives and thought he had seen the coldness and treachery of the world, he still did not dare believe this kind of judgment. He lowered his voice and said, Can you not even trust them? Wu Zhu's voice became even colder. It is my habit to trust no one. That kind of life will be very difficult. Fan Xian closed his eyes as if he was simulating an eternal life in the dark. After they die, what will you do? Wu Zhu rarely asked a question, and this one hit Fan Xian where it hurt. Fan Xian frowned and said, I understand. Wu Zhu ignored his expression and continued speaking without a trace of emotion. The only thing that can protect you is not conspiracy, not power, not anything else. It is only power. You must remember this. Fan Xian stood up from the side of the bed and bowed respectfully toward this servant, this teacher, this elder brother. I do not know what the lady left you in the box, but I do know that you must have enough power to protect yourself and intimidate your enemies. Determination is also a kind of power, so I want you to find that key. Yes, I will take care of it immediately. When Fan Xian raised his head, he found that Wu Zhu had once again disappeared into the night. In the 10 years they had spent together, Wu Zhu rarely spoke so much in one go, other than on rainy nights when he thought of his mother. Fan Xian understood what Wu Zhu meant. The prosperity of the capital was bone-crushing and soul-consuming. It had indeed caused the calmness and strength that he had honed since he was young to show signs of weakness. This was a warning to him not to rely too much on the so-called power of his family and the legacy of his mother. These days, although he had worked hard to cultivate the tyrannical Jinqi in his body and to familiarize himself with the 3 poisonous needles, it was as Wu Zhu had said. His heart was not as strong as it had been in Danzhou. The only thing that can protect each and every one of us is our own strength. A child without a mother is like a blade of grass. Even the grass has to run out of the cracks in the rock. Ignore the sun and the rain. Take root deeper and make your stem sturdier. That is the right path. Chapter 128. The sky in the east had already turned red. The sun slowly rose from the sleepy clouds and shone on the capital's grandest buildings. The outer walls of the palace were even redder than the sky. They calmly and terrifyingly watched the crowd in the square in front of them. Fan Xian was also one of these people. He looked at the tall palace walls and the bottomless doorway at the bottom of the wall. He felt that this dark place was very much like the mouth of a monster. He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of nervousness. Fan Xian, like everyone else in the world, still felt a sense of awe when faced with this solemn symbol of imperial power. But awe didn't mean obedience, and it didn't mean no resistance. This was where he was different from everyone else. After the guards at the palace gate examined them, they nodded with a trace of arrogance. Fan Xian and his group obediently walked in. Today was the day of the festival, and the palace had issued an edict to summon an 8th-level functionary into the palace. The edict had arrived yesterday, and Fan Manor had been busy all night before deciding on the number of people to enter the palace. Naturally, Fan Jian wouldn't go. There were few women in Count Sinan's manor, so a few distant relatives of the Fan clan in the capital had come forward to volunteer. Fan Xian had never seen such excitement before, and Fan Jian coldly put an end to everyone's thoughts. In the end, it was decided that Lady Lu and Fan Ruoruo would accompany Fan Xian into the palace, along with 2 old nannies. These 2 old nannies had been around his grandmother's time in Danzhou, and were very familiar with the rules of the palace. Lady Lu's willingness to follow Fan Xian into the palace was somewhat unexpected to Fan Xian. He knew that although Lady Lu had never been promoted, she had in fact been in contact with some of the nobles in the palace since she was a child. Their relationship was not ordinary. With her by his side, Fan Xian's trip to the palace would probably be much smoother. The sound of light and hurried footsteps echoed in the quiet doorway. The doorway was so deep that the rising sun could only illuminate half of it. The other half was particularly dark. A cold wind suddenly blew out from the palace walls, making it difficult for everyone to keep their eyes open. The weather of August and September suddenly had a hint of the chilly late autumn. Fan Xian subtly touched his belt and felt the pills that were smaller than soybeans. He felt a little more at ease. He knew that the checks for entering the palace were particularly strict, so before he left the manor, he hid his secret crossbow and dagger in his room. However, Uncle Wu Zhu's lecture had left a deep impression on him. Even though he was in the royal palace, the safest place in the world, he still prepared a few life-saving tricks. Ta 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 ta. Man is a very strange animal and people are a very strange group. Walking under the quiet palace walls, the footsteps of the group of 6 people gradually became synchronized. They landed on the ground at the same time and raised their feet at the same time. Following the little eunuch in the lead, they sounded the same monotonous syllable as if they were playing a 4-string zither at the same time. A wave of discomfort welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He forced himself to pause and let his footsteps stagger with the others. The synchronized footsteps under the palace walls were immediately broken. He gently pulled his sister's sleeve and said in a low voice, "I'm a little nervous." Fan Ruoruo smiled and wanted to give him some encouragement. But the little eunuch in front of them turned his head and looked at Fan Xian with a frown. He seemed a little dissatisfied. Lady Lu frowned and said quietly, "The palace is not like other places. Be careful what you say." The little eunuch wasn't handsome and he had a worried look on his face. Hearing Countess Sinan's words, he suddenly felt that he had gained some glory. Where was this? This was the royal palace. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He hadn't expected Lady Lu to continue with a smile. But there's no need to be nervous. I've been in this palace since I was a child. At that time Eunuch Hong was the leader of the eunuchs. In the blink of an eye, it's little children who serve in the palace. Hearing this, the little eunuch in front of him didn't dare put on airs. He hurriedly walked into the palace. He had thought he was bringing some country bumpkins into the palace, but it turned out to be acquaintances visiting relatives. The royal palace was enormous. After the long entrance to the city, there was a large square made of bluestone, which made one feel suddenly enlightened. The early morning sun shone on the roof of the Taiji Palace's main hall, and the yellow glazed tiles reflected a dazzling luster. There was a large column several meters away from the hall, and the long stone steps in front of the hall looked like a white jade road leading to the Milky Way. Fan Xian squinted at the building in front of him, and a sense of absurdity welled up in his heart. He wondered if he had arrived at the palace museum. Perhaps this sense of absurdity diluted his nervousness and his sense of estrangement from the unfamiliar palace. For the rest of the journey, Fan Xian finally returned to his natural demeanor. He looked a little like he had when he first entered Fan Manor. His face was full of smiles, and he looked around at the palace maids and eunuchs with their heads bowed as they walked along the palace walls. Occasionally he raised his head to look at the eaves in the distance, but he didn't know which palace it was and he didn't know who lived there. The young eunuch shook his head, but a faintly discernible smile floated on Lady Lu's lips. She thought to herself, this eldest young master really has a personality that fears neither the heavens nor the earth. The purpose of entering the palace today was simple. The concubines in the palace wanted to see what the talented Fan Xian who was about to marry China looked like. Although the purpose was simple, the process was particularly complicated. So everyone in Fan Manor got up early, washed up and dressed up. They rushed into the palace as soon as the palace doors opened, and then waited in a corner room, waiting for one of the concubines to summon them. Those who were summoned could wait, but the concubines in the palace were not willing to wait. Because he had gotten up so early, Fan Xian sat in the corner room, drinking the palace's fine tea. He was still sleepy and his spirit was not good. Lady Lu glanced at him and stood up with a smile. She said to the eunuch who had come to greet them in the palace, "Eunuch Ho, long time no see." As she said this, she extended her finger and handed over the banknotes without the slightest hint of anger. Fan Xian peeked and the corners of his lips curled up. He almost laughed. His aunt's methods had indeed been influenced by his father, and she relied on banknotes to beat people. Unexpectedly, Eunuch Ho looked embarrassed and respectfully said, "Lady Fan, aren't you slapping me in the face? You grew up with the masters in the palace and I wouldn't dare beg for food here." Hearing this, Lady Lu couldn't help but laugh. "This is a reward for you, not a purchase. What are you afraid of?" Eunuch Ho chuckled and the wrinkles on his face squeezed together. He said quietly, "They know you're entering the palace today, and there's no reason for them to keep you waiting for too long. Don't worry, it's just that it's too early and I'm afraid they're all busy washing up. I'll just sit for a bit." Fan Xian's ears twitched, and he realized that the old eunuch was referring to Lady Lu as Lady Fan. It seemed that the palace was already leaning towards Lady Lu's promotion. He also heard that the various palaces were still cleaning the courtyards in the morning. He had originally felt that he had woken up too early and had come too early. Hearing this, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Fortunately, Eunuch Ho was right. Count Sinon was wise to have Lady Lu accompany him to the palace. Before the morning court had even begun, the 3 members of the Fan family had already entered the rear palace. The 2 old nannies were received outside, and there was good tea and water. They were old people who had been in the palace for a long time, and they didn't mind the boredom. The first to go was to Yigui Pin. She was the mother of the 3rd prince, and because she was a mother who relied on her son's status, she was promoted from a talented person to a Gui Pin. Fan Xian bowed respectfully and then heard a gentle voice. "Rise." Yigui Pin was born plain and clean, but that was all. She was not at all as beautiful as Fan Xian had imagined. Much to Fan Xian's surprise, Lady Lu looked at Yigui Pin with moist eyes. After the 2 women bowed, they held hands and looked at each other, speechless. Fan Xian looked at his sister with a puzzled expression. Ruoro's face was calm and she was not at all surprised. After listening to them talk for a while, Fan Xian realized that Yigui Pin was actually Lady Lu's cousin. Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. Only now did he realize that the Lu family had such deep roots. Fortunately, he had carried out a policy of appeasement after entering the capital, and Lady Lu had treated him kindly. Otherwise, if the 2 of them had really clashed, who knew who would have died? "Why haven't you come to the palace to see me?" Yigui Pin wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes. "It's been 4 years, and you have the heart to leave me alone in the palace. It wasn't easy to get an edict to summon you to the palace to talk with me. Who knew you wouldn't come? You've really depressed me to death." A trace of sadness flashed across Lady Lu's face. She didn't speak for a while. After a while she said quietly, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." She didn't look at Fan Xian, but Fan Xian looked at Lady Lu's slightly thin shoulders. A strange light flashed in his eyes. Hearing Yigui Pin speak of 4 years, he very sensitively thought of the assassination attempt in Danzhou. According to his father, Lady Lu was only a scapegoat for the assassination attempt. The real masterminds behind the scenes were the 2 most noble women in the palace. Was that the reason Lady Lu hadn't entered the palace for 4 years? "In the future, I will often come to the palace to see you." Lady Lu smiled warmly and took Yigui Pin's hand. "Didn't I come today?" Yigui Pin's anger turned into a smile. "If it weren't for the fact that the young master of the Fan family is going to marry the most precious girl in the palace, I wouldn't have hoped to see you." She turned to Fan Xian and asked gently, "You are Fan Xian?" Fan Xian hurriedly stood up. His elegant face was filled with the warmest of smiles. He bowed to the ground. Nephew Fan Xian greets Aunt Lu. This was against the rules. The palace maids and eunuchs were stunned. Lady Lu was also a little surprised. She thought to herself, I'm not your real mother. But Fan Xian shamelessly claimed a relationship. Clearly Yi Guipin, who was tired of the rules of the palace, liked it. She looked at Fan Xian and beamed. You really are a good child. Chapter 129. There were many ridiculous things in this world, but to be judged as a good child after saying only 8 words, even Fan Xian, who was almost 17 years old, felt that this matter was ridiculous to the extreme. This palace was indeed different from other places. The judgments of the high and mighty nobles seemed to be too arbitrary and dependent on their own preferences. Although Fan Xian did not know the relationship between Lady Lu and Yi Guipin, it did not prevent him from learning from Wanner that Yi Guipin was a highly favored concubine. Otherwise, she would not have been able to give birth to an 8-year-old prince, despite the emperor's reputation of cultivating his moral character and keeping away from women. As they chatted in the palace, Yi Guipin seemed to really like Fan Xian. The expression on her face grew happier and happier. Fan Xian was tactful and picked out a few jokes he remembered from his previous life to listen to them. Suddenly, there was a burst of bell-like laughter in the palace hall. Fan Xian found that Lady Guipin's temperament was straightforward and ruthless. He did not know how she was able to maintain such a temperament in this shameful palace. He could not help but be surprised and admire her. After chatting for a while, the sun had already gradually risen. Lady Lu smiled and asked, "Where is the third prince?" Yi Guipin sighed and said, "That child is still very afraid of strangers. As soon as he wakes up, he shrinks himself in the back of the palace and doesn't want to come out. I'm afraid he won't show his face until it's time to eat." Lady Lu laughed and said, "It turns out that our third prince is quite shy." Although there was a difference between master and subject, Lady Lu and Yi Guipin were still sisters, so their words were not as particular. Yi Guipin stretched out her slender index finger. Her nails were painted red and looked very attractive. She pointed at Fan Xian and said, "Isn't this one of yours also shy?" At that moment, a shy smile appeared on Fan Xian's face, just in response to Yi Guipin's words. "Well, sister, you and Ruoruo can stay here and chat with me." Yi Guipin seemed to know that Lady Lu did not want to go to the Empress and the eldest princess, so she made the decision to keep them as guests. "I will let Xinger take Fan Xian to those palaces." Madame Lu's expression darkened slightly. She bowed and said, "How can this be done? Today I received the imperial edict to enter the palace and be the first to see Guipin Yang. I was originally worried that I would offend those Yang. If I enter the palace and don't visit those Yang, I'm afraid it would be somewhat disrespectful." Hearing these words, Yi Guipin snorted and said, "Sister, I think it's best if you don't go. Originally it was just to summon Fan Xian into the palace. You should keep me company and talk. I want to see who in the palace dares to make irresponsible remarks." Yi Guipin was a cheerful noblewoman with a trace of naivety, but when she lost her temper, she still appeared very dignified. The entire palace quieted down. Fan Xian coughed lightly and said, "Auntie? Second madam, I will go by myself. You and my sister can keep Aunt Lu company and talk for a while." Hearing him say this, Madame Lu had no choice but to agree. She and the serving girl called Xing escorted Fan Xian outside the palace. In a quiet voice, she warned him of a few things to take note of, and without anyone noticing, she moved to Fan Xian's shoulder. In a voice as quiet as a mosquito, she said, "Everyone in the palace has been informed. There will be people in each palace to receive you. Don't be too nervous." Fan Xian's heart trembled and he complied. Turning around, he saw that his sister had followed him out, looking at him encouragingly. For some reason, his heart was filled with warmth. He smiled and thought, when a mother-in-law looks at a son-in-law, the more she looks at him, the more she likes him. Furthermore, I was born with such a beautiful body. Dealing with a few resentful women in the palace should be a piece of cake. After the candidate for the emperor's son-in-law had left Yi Guipin's palace, Madame Lu said a few words to Fan Ruoruo, and then entered the inner chambers with Yi Guipin. Yi Guipin quietly looked into her eyes and said, "For years ago, I advised you not to listen to the advice of those 2 palaces. Now Fan Xian is still alive and well, but you have chilled Sir Fan's heart. Sister, you have been intelligent your whole life. How could you have made such a mistake?" Madame Lu stood where she was, speechless for a long time. Her eyes gradually became resentful and she quietly said, You also know that as mothers, don't we think for our children? The third prince is still young, so you can stay out of it. In a few years, I'm afraid you will understand why I made such a big mistake. Xing'er was a young girl of about 13 or 14 years of age. As they walked through the palace, Fan Xian noticed that the girl's head was always lowered. He couldn't help but tease her. Can't you see where you're going? Xing'er giggled, revealing her small teeth. Master Fan, it's best not to talk too much in the palace. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He knew that there were many rules in the palace, but he didn't think that even a young girl would be so cautious and self-restrained. Fan Xian followed behind Xing'er, looking at the clothes she wore. His eyes swept over the girl's undeveloped waist, and then immediately turned to the buildings of the palace. There was a smile on his face, but his brain was working quickly, trying to memorize the complicated scenery of the road in his mind, in preparation for that matter in the future. As they walked, they passed by flowers and trees and stepped on stones and grass. Although the palace was large, there was a time when they would arrive. Although there were many palaces, not all of them were so grand that they could shake one's heart. Looking at the quiet courtyard in front of him, Fan Xian took a deep breath and followed Xing'er inside. This was the residence of the second prince's birth mother, Imperial Concubine Shu. This imperial concubine seemed to love peace and quiet. The courtyard was also decorated very simply and elegantly. Apart from a few pink flowering trees, there were no other decorations. A bamboo curtain covered everything inside, but it could not hide the fragrance of books seeping out from the curtains. Greetings, Concubine Shu. Master Fan, please sit. Without exchanging pleasantries, Fan Xian and Concubine Shu sat apart from the curtain. Without any warning, Concubine Shu suddenly asked in a clear voice, 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn, always a guest. Master Fan, when you were young you were often in Danzhou. Do you think the capital is only a place for guests? Fan Xian was a bit surprised, but he answered with a straight face. Using this as a starting point, he and Concubine Shu sat down and discussed the Tao. They talked about all the classics and poems in the world, until their mouths were a bit dry. Only then did they tacitly stop talking. Fan Xian felt some lingering fear. He really didn't think that the second prince's mother was a talented woman of the palace. She was so knowledgeable that he almost couldn't deal with her. He couldn't help but think, what kind of person would a prince be raised by such a woman? Don't be nervous. Concubine Shu's temperament was very gentle. Through the bamboo curtain, he could faintly see that there was only a wooden fork on her head. She was so plain that she was out of place in the palace. Grew up in the palace. Before His Majesty took her as his adopted daughter, we had nothing to do, so we raised her like a daughter. There is no one in the palace who doesn't like her. So if Master Fan wants to marry the most precious pearl of the palace, we can't help but watch. Fan Xian's back was covered in a cold sweat. Although he usually had some understanding, it was only today that he truly felt his fiancée's position in the palace. Concubine Shu was gentle and light. She seemed to be quite satisfied with Fan Xian's way of talking. After a while, she let Fan Xian leave. But before they parted, she said quietly, I like to read, and His Majesty has collected some rare books for me. I have already let the palace servants select some of the precious ones and make copies. Master Fan, if you want to go to the other concubines, I will have them sent to Yigui Pin. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that this was a generous gift. He knew that this concubine was giving it on behalf of the second prince. He didn't dare to say anything more. He calmly bowed and left. After leaving Concubine Shu's courtyard, Fan Xian wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The palace maid leading the way, Xing'er, was a little familiar with him. She walked on her tiptoes, hopping and skipping. She looked back at his expression and asked curiously, It's not hot today. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He had thought that entering the palace today was just a courtesy visit. He didn't know that it was even more tense than the palace examination. Presumably, the concubines in the palace were very curious about Lin Wan'er marrying him, so they wanted to see Fan Xian's literary and martial talents. Next, the two of them went to the great prince's birth mother, Ning the Talented. Fan Xian knew that although this woman's position was not high, and she was only a talented person, he knew from Wan'er that it was because she was from Dongyi. So Fan Xian purposely treated her with respect. Ning the Talented was nearly 40 years old, but she still retained her charm. Her expression was very gentle, like that of a Dongyi woman. These years the great prince had been in Chushu and she had no one. It was inevitable that she would be lonely. Fortunately, when Lin Wan'er was in the palace, she often came here to play, so her feelings for Wan'er were not the same as those of the other concubines. She looked at Fan Xian coldly. Her phoenix eyes were cold. You are Fan Xian. Fan Xian knew that this noble lady had once saved the emperor on the battlefield, and had raised a prince who was good at war. She was certainly a very dignified person, so he wasn't surprised. He calmly replied, I am. Ning the Talented looked him up and down. Unexpectedly, she didn't say anything. She only coldly said, treat Wan'er well. Fan Xian liked this clean and efficient feeling. He happily replied, please do not worry, concubine. That incident on Yolan Street must have been strange. I don't believe you could kill an 8th level ace. Ning the Talented looked him up and down and snorted. Looking at your thin and weak appearance, you don't look like someone who is good at fighting. Fan Xian was startled. Could it be that he had just finished taking an exam in literature, and now he was about to take an exam in martial arts? But concubine, you are a 40-year-old lady. There is a difference between master and subject and between men and women. Surely you wouldn't go so far as to beat him with your fists? But since Yi Ling admits that she is no match for you, I will have to make do with it. That's all for today. Go to another palace, don't waste too much time. Having said this, Ning the Talented had nothing else to say. She chased him out of the palace hall. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head and looked at the tightly shut wooden door. He thought to himself, His Majesty really is a lucky man. The women lying by his side are so colorful. There is Yi Guipin, who is the bright and innocent type, Lady Shu, who is the intellectual and virtuous type, and he even has a wild girlfriend like Ning the Talented. But he already knew that Lady Shu was very talented, and that Ning the Talented was probably a person who was rough on the outside but meticulous on the inside. Add to that the unfathomable Empress, and the fact that His Majesty was able to put all these women in one large room and live in peace for so many years, it had to be said that His Majesty, the Emperor of the Kingdom of Qin, was very powerful. At least, Fan Xian didn't have that kind of ability. Chapter 130. Still walking through the palace, Fan Xian saw a few more ladies, chatted with them, and received a few rewards. He couldn't help but feel a little bored. But he didn't dare show any expression on his face. This was the palace after all. Who knew whose subordinate the eunuch next to him was, and whose confidant the young serving girl plucking the willow branches was? If his annoyance was seen by these people, then they would whisper it to their masters, and their masters would whisper it to the emperor's pillow. Would he feel any better? Even if he and the emperor were friends who had drunk tea and chatted, he could only suffer a blow without being able to defend himself. But thinking of the people he was going to see, Fan Xian's heart had long since calmed down, and there was even a hint of coldness and cruelty. But when he looked at the palace, his eyes were still full of smiles, as if he was very much looking forward to it. Yaohua Palace was much larger than the other palaces and courtyards, highlighting the identity of its owner. The person who lived here was the Empress of the Kingdom of Qin, the motherly model of the world. Fan Xian had not expected that the Empress summons would end so simply. The Empress smiled warmly, and her words made Fan Xian feel as if he was bathing in a spring breeze. Looking at the Empress' bright and beautiful face, looking at the Empress' eyes that were as calm as water, Fan Xian respectfully responded. His heart was filled with a strange feeling. This elegant and noble woman before him, whose every movement made him feel very comfortable, was actually the person who had wanted to kill him 4 years ago. Kneeling down and kowtowing twice, Fan Xian left Yaohua Palace with a somewhat uneasy expression. His meeting with the Empress had started so simply, and ended so hastily. Seeing how well he had concealed his emotions, and even not showing any strange emotions, it could only mean that the Empress looked at Fan Xian without any unease. Fan Xian smiled, the corners of his lips slightly parted, but his heart was cold. Perhaps in the end he had overestimated his importance. For these nobles in the palace, wanting to kill him 4 years ago was probably a very small matter. Outside the gates of Guangxin Palace, the eunuchs who had followed him carefully moved to the back, not daring to breathe too loudly. The serving girl Xinger was also very conspicuous. In a low voice she said to Fan Xian, "Master Fan, please come in." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, thinking that if he went in without being summoned, it would be somewhat against the rules. What if he was killed by the eldest princess mother-in-law? Lin Chong had fallen for the same trick back then. But he knew it wasn't that scary today. These eunuchs and maids were just afraid of the eldest princess for no reason. The eldest princess Li Yunrui. Her name had a bit of masculinity, but she was a very weak person. Of course, this was just a facade. She had many identities. She was the de facto controller of the palace treasury, the prime minister's old lover, the emperor's most capable political assistant, a transcendent presence in the harem, and the empress dowager's most beloved daughter. For Fan Xian, the other party actually only had two identities. One was an enemy who had once wanted to kill him. The second was his future mother-in-law. Guang Xian Palace was cold and gloomy. In broad daylight, the palace doors were naturally not closed. Standing outside the door, one could see some sleeping plum blossoms, heat-averse orchids, old green bamboos, and daisies that had yet to bloom. In the palace, one could see many white muslin curtains fluttering in the wind. The overall feeling was as pure and tender as a fairy tale world. A chill appeared between Fan Xian's brows. It was as if he had been infected by the aura of the palace. A maid in her 20s appeared at the door and bowed slightly to Fan Xian. The maid's eyebrows were extremely long, and her eyes were somewhat cold. But her speech and body movements were still very courteous. She respectfully welcomed Fan Xian into the palace. Muslin. It was all muslin. Fan Xian was a little stunned as he pulled away the white muslin. There were many more muslin curtains in Guang Xian Palace than he had seen in the back garden of King Jing's manor. The decorations around him were also a little strange. It didn't match the solemn atmosphere of the palace. It was more like the living quarters of a young girl waiting to be married. At the end of the heavy curtains was a low bed. A woman in a light pink dress was lying on it. She supported her chin with one arm, and her waist naturally revealed a sense of elegance. Her eyebrows and eyes were picturesque, but her expression was timid and lovable. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his mother-in-law, the eldest princess. Like many people who saw the eldest princess Li Yunrui for the first time, he was dumbfounded. He didn't know if the woman in front of him was real or fake. Was she a figure in a painting or a fairy in the water? The eldest princess was 30 years old, but her demeanor was very much like that of a young girl who had just turned 16. Her eyebrows, and the straight black hair that fell naturally on the arm of the bed, were enough to make any man in the world yearn for her. Fan Xian's face was full of shock. But his strange encounter and the temperament he had trained in Danzhou for 16 years made his mind a sea of calm. But he still had to admit that although his mother-in-law looked like Wan she was much more beautiful. Although Fan Xian could still maintain his calm, he didn't want to call her mother-in-law in his heart. It seemed that calling her that did not match her natural beauty. The eldest princess looked at Fan Xian. That look contained a lot of meaning. She was timid and lovable. She opened her pale lips and said, "Pick up a chair and sit. I have a headache." Fan Xian looked around uneasily. He realized that the eldest princess had said something unnecessary. In the vast Guangxin palace, there was not a single chair. As he was puzzled, he heard the eldest princess say softly, "Minister Fan, I hear that you are skilled in medicine. Wan'er's health has improved greatly these days. It's all thanks to you." Fan Xian quickly bowed. "Eldest princess is too kind. It's all because of the royal doctor's meticulous care. I'm just giving you a few folk remedies." The eldest princess stretched out her slender fingers and rubbed her temples. As her fingertips rubbed, her forehead gradually turned red. "Is there a folk remedy for migraines? I've had a terrible headache these days." The eldest princess had a chronic headache. Fan Xian had heard about this from one. Last time, outside the summer estate, he had heard the crown prince mention it. But Fan Xian paid more attention to how the eldest princess addressed him and how she referred to herself. In their few sentences, the eldest princess referred to him as "you" and "me." It seemed particularly intimate. Fan Xian smiled. "There are many kinds of headaches. When my teacher taught here, he had a headache as well." His words were light, but the two headaches were quite interesting. The eldest princess smiled gently and her charm grew. Fan Xian knew that his relationship with Fei Jia was no secret in the capital. There was no way he could hide it from the eldest princess, so he made it clear. "Is there really no good way?" The eldest princess didn't ask about anything else today. Her only concern was the headache. Her face was full of worry and she looked very weak. "These days I've been in so much pain." Fan Xian lowered his eyes slightly and calmed his mind. "I've learned a method of massage. Although it can only treat the symptoms and not the root, it has a soothing effect." The eldest princess's eyes brightened. "Then hurry and try it," she said softly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I'm afraid it's a little inconvenient." The eldest princess covered her mouth and giggled. "I didn't think that the famous great scholar Fan in the capital would be such a polite little scholar. Not to mention that this is an emergency, you'll be my son in a few days. What's there to be afraid of?" Fan Xian looked at the eldest princess's youthful demeanor and thought of her true age. He should have felt disgusted, but looking at the eldest princess's tender cheeks and her eyebrows, which were as clear as a young leaf, it was hard to feel disgusted. But hearing the word son, he still laughed coldly in his heart. His face was calm and he replied, "How could I dare disobey the orders of my elders?" A eunuch brought a copper basin of clean water. Fan Xian carefully washed his hands, and then slowly walked to the eldest princess's side. He took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions. He did his best not to let his gaze fall on the eldest princess's white neck, which was slightly exposed under her black hair. He steadily stretched out his hands and placed them on her head. His fingers ran through the eldest princess's black hair. The tip of her hair floated gently, and there was a slight itch. Fan Xian simply closed his eyes, imagining that he was like Wu Zhu, covered with a black cloth. His fingertips touched the eldest princess's hairline, and then gently moved upwards. His thumbs pressed against her temples, and his 2 index fingers traced along her eyebrows, confirming the position between her eyebrows. He knocked. The eldest princess seemed unprepared. She gave a light grunt, but it was hard to tell whether it was from pain or from where he had pressed. Fan Xian was calm. Relying on his knowledge of the human body's acupuncture points, he slowly and steadily massaged her head. Every time his fingers made contact with Li Yunrui's skin, it was steady. The Grand Princess frowned, wondering if she had been a little rash. She never thought that this little fellow's technique would be so good. His fingertips seemed to carry a fine stream of air, rubbing the source of her pain. Every time he pressed, it would make her feel much more relaxed. Her mind gradually relaxed and she seemed to slowly feel sleepy. "Did Fei Jie teach you this technique?" she asked casually, her eyes half closed as she leaned against the bed. "Sir Fei taught me how to recognize acupuncture points." Fan Xian's fingers continued to move steadily across her smooth skin. His voice did not tremble in the slightest. "This massage technique, however, was learned by myself. As the saying goes, a long illness makes a doctor. In his previous life, when he was lying on a sickbed in the beginning, he still had a glimmer of hope that he would be able to stand up again. That was why that cute little nurse often massaged his legs and the muscles of his body. But in the end he had given up hope. As for the massage technique, Fan Xian remembered it. Not bad. The eldest princess praised him. She slowly closed her eyes again, enjoying the warm and relaxing feeling brought by the young man's hands. Guangxin Palace was silent. The eldest princess's eyes remained closed. Her long eyelashes rested on her fair skin, trembling slightly. She suddenly said, "If you want to marry Wano, then you must forget what happened 4 years ago." Fan Xian's fingers paused, stopping just below the eldest princess's ear. It seemed ordinary, but it was a fatal acupuncture point. Chapter 131. It was only for a moment, and Fan Xian immediately smiled and began to knead again. His voice, however, was slightly surprised. 4 years ago? The eldest princess smiled, and the corners of her lips arched into a beautiful curve. She seemed to be secretly admiring this young man. She changed the subject. "When did Fei Jie start teaching you?" Fan Xian knew that she was testing him. His expression did not change and he calmly replied, "That was when I was young." His words were very vague, and the eldest princess could not ask for too much detail due to her status. She said with a faint smile, "If I did not know that Fei Jie was your teacher, I think many people in the palace, including those in the palace, would not know that the Fan family has such a close relationship with the Overwatch Council." Fan Xian's hands became gentler, and his reply became more careful. "I'm not very sure. Perhaps father and Fei Jie knew each other in the past." The eldest princess gently said, "Of course they knew each other. During the first northern expedition your father and Fei Jie were both with the emperor in the army tent. It would be strange to say that they did not know each other. But I was very young back then, so it is even more impossible for you to know about these things." "Yes." Fan Xian knew that the more he said, the more likely he would be to slip up. He smiled and said nothing more. The eldest princess seemed to be in the mood for conversation. She continued to ask, "How is your grandmother?" "She is in good health." "Yes, I have not seen her in a long time," the eldest princess replied weakly. "When I was young, I liked your grandmother the most. Every time my brother wanted to bully me, she was the one who protected me." Fan Xian smiled and thought, "If grandmother knew that you wanted to kill me now, I am afraid she would have taken a wooden stick and beaten you to death." I believe that Sir Fan should have explained His Majesty's intentions clearly to you. The eldest princess's sweet and gentle words suddenly brought up such a serious topic. Comparing the two, it was especially cold. Fan Xian's brows furrowed imperceptibly. He knew that she was talking about the matter of the palace treasury. At this time he could no longer play dumb. All he could do was smile and say, "I will follow His Majesty's arrangements." I heard that you recently opened a bookstore and a tofu shop in the capital. The eldest princess could not help but smile. With her eyes closed, her smile was as beautiful as ever. The children of aristocratic families are mostly useless people who only know how to talk and do nothing. I admire you for being able to enter this line of work in preparation for taking over the palace treasury in the future. It's just that the matter of the tofu shop was a bit too much. Fan Xian chuckled, not knowing how to deal with it. Actually, I want to kill you. The atmosphere, which had just seemed to have become more harmonious, immediately turned into the cold night of the Qin kingdom's northern border because of the eldest princess' cold words with a smile on her face. It froze everything in Guangxin Palace. The warm white gauze fluttering around them also drooped down weakly. Fan Xian maintained his gentle smile, but he moved his right foot back 2 inches, assuming the position where it was easiest to exert force. The Overwatch Council had long discovered the relationship between Wu Bowen and this woman. Since this woman had already tried to kill him twice, it would not be impossible for her to do it a third time in Guangxin Palace, which was filled with hidden murderous intent. Of course, everyone in the capital knew that he had entered the palace. Logically speaking, no one would be crazy enough to try to kill him in the palace. But after entering Guangxin Palace, seeing the eldest princess' childish demeanor and tone of voice, Fan Xian felt an inexplicable chill in his heart. This woman seemed to be crazy. He was now massaging the eldest princess' head. Although it was her request and he was going to marry her daughter, there was a difference between a man and a woman. What if this woman casually used the crime of flirting with the princess and incestuous to send people to kill him? What could the people behind him do? They would not be able to save him in time. Fan Xian knew that the truly terrifying things in this world were children, women, and crazy people. Because these 3 types of people could not be judged or analyzed rationally. At any time they could do something crazy with serious consequences. And in Fan Xian's eyes, this extremely beautiful young woman under his command was, without a doubt, a combination of these 3 poisons. She was a clear-minded and ruthless woman, but her actions were childish and her methods were crazy. She made up the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, who was different from the others and particularly terrifying. At this moment, a few serving girls walked into the palace. They wore light pomegranate-colored, tight-fitting serving girl robes that showed off their curves, but were very convenient to attack. Their belts were a bit thick, and Fan Xian, who had immersed himself in the art of assassination for 10 years in Danzhou, could immediately see that within those belts were extremely sharp swords. But his fingers continued to steadily rub the soft skin under the eldest princess' ear. With a face full of smiles, he said, "Princess, why do you want to kill me? Many people think I have a reason to kill you, and it is a very good reason." The eldest princess' eyes were still closed, as if she was not at all afraid that Fan Xian would suddenly counterattack and kill her under his fingers. Fan Xian lowered his head and did not reply. It was as if he was concentrating all of his attention on his fingers. Actually, his eyes were tightly closed up until now. Guangxin Palace was so quiet that even a ghost cat could be heard walking by. A few serving girls slowly moved closer to the eldest princess' side. Fan Xian's eyes were closed, but his head was slightly tilted to the right. "Master Fan, please clean your hands." Who knew where the serving girls came from, but the serving girls brought warm water and towels. Fan Xian opened his eyes and bowed to the eldest princess. He smiled and thanked the serving girls. He soaked his somewhat numb hands in the warm water and wiped them clean with a towel. He bowed all the way to the ground. "Does your highness feel better?" The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. There was still a trace of timidity in her soft eyes, but Fan Xian knew that this woman was definitely one of the most terrifying people in the world. "Much better." The eldest princess slowly straightened her body and tidied her black hair. She lowered her head and said gently, "I did not think that the husband that Wan is about to marry would have such a good skill. To tell the truth, I am a little reluctant to part with you." Fan Xian stood respectfully and quietly at the lower end, not daring to say anything more. He knew that when faced with such a woman, no matter what he said, it would create a difficult result to analyze. Thus, he might as well play the trick of not saying 1,000 words as one. "You go. I'm a little tired." The eldest princess's lips bloomed like a flower. She said softly, "Tell Sister Lu that she did not come to see me today. I'm very disappointed." After Fan Xian respectfully left Guangxin Palace, the eldest princess trusted serving girl walked to her side and quietly asked, "Princess, should we kill him?" "I was just playing with a child. Otherwise life in the palace would be really boring." The eldest princess stretched like a cat. She was very lazy and very seductive. "This young man is really beyond my expectations. He is like a person in his 30s or 40s. He is very tolerant and very good at hiding." The eldest princess did not have any intention of killing him at first. But seeing Fan Xian's every step of defense and not a single flaw, this wonderful woman who saw fighting as a game, gradually began to itch in her heart. Given her position in the palace and the perverted mentality that even Fan Xian could think of, if Fan Xian actually lost focus for a moment, she would probably give the order to kill him. Her gaze glanced at the palace door that was faintly visible through the layers of white gauze. A strange smile rose to the corners of her lips. She thought to herself, "In the instant you were about to attack, you slightly tilted your head. What did that mean? I'm truly curious. Fan Xian, how did you grow up? What a pity." He didn't know what this woman was feeling sorry for. Perhaps it was for the danger that Fan Xian would face in a few days. Fan Xian grew up playing with poisons, so he realized that the eldest princess was a rare and powerful poison. She was a difficult character for him to deal with. Leaving Guangxin Palace, he looked expressionlessly at the dozing palace maid Xing and said coldly, "Let's go back." He then walked toward Yi Guiping's palace. Surprisingly, he didn't go the wrong way. Only now did Xing realize that Master Fan's back was already wet with sweat. His light blue robe had a dark mark on it. He looked very wretched. Leaving the palace, Fan Xian boarded the carriage waiting at the far end of the square. His face was a little pale. His hand rested on his abdomen and pressed on the pill in his belt. He laughed at himself, not knowing whether he was a careful thinker or a coward. If the eldest princess really wanted to kill him, why would she choose Guangxin Palace? "Are you all right?" Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother sympathetically. She had no idea how tiring his conversation in Guangxin Palace had been. She thought he was just tired from going around visiting the Empress. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. He relayed to Lady Lu the greetings that the Empress had asked him to pass on. He then urged the carriage to hurry back to the manor. Lady Lu and Fan Ruoruo looked at him curiously. They didn't understand why he was in such a hurry. The carriage drove into a side alley next to Fan Manor. Fan Xian excused himself to Lady Lu, then took his sister's slightly cold hand and rushed to the back garden. After a short while they were in the study. Fan Ruoruo pressed on her heaving chest and said breathlessly, "Brother, what are you doing?" Chapter 132. Fan Xian didn't have time to explain. He smiled and ordered, "I'll talk, you remember?" He didn't have time to grind the ink. He picked up a quill, dipped it in some of the ink left in the inkstone and gave it to his sister. He then closed his eyes and began to recall the complicated layout of the palace courtyards and paths. The more Fan Ruoruo wrote, the paler her face became. Because Fan Xian was trying to memorize, his face also became paler. The two of them looked like two white faces. With great difficulty, Fan Ruoruo drew most of the paths in the palace. Finally, Fan Ruoruo couldn't help but cry out in a low voice, "Brother, don't you know that this is a great crime?" Fan Xian relaxed and sat down in a chair. He didn't speak for a long time. Today he had spent half a day in the palace. He had to chat with the nobles and remember the complicated roads. In the end, he had to have a mental battle with the eldest princess for a long time. It was too exhausting and he couldn't recover for a while. He was familiar with the laws of the Qing kingdom, and he knew that the palace buildings were not allowed to be drawn. This was to prevent people from sneaking into the palace to do treasonous things. Fan Xian needed this map because he had already made a plan. In this plan he would sneak into the palace that night to find the key. He could ask Lin Wan'er about the paths in the palace, but that was too risky. Furthermore, the paths taken by the masters of the palace were completely different from the paths Fan Xian had carefully planned. Even if Wu Zhu told him it wouldn't work, like the hiding places behind the fake mountains, or the blind spots in the bushes of flowers, if he hadn't walked them himself, he wouldn't have been able to draw a map that satisfied him. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the table to pick up his sister's drawing. Although it was done in a hurry, his sister's brushwork was still meticulous. He couldn't help but happily pat her on the head. "It's done. I'll invite you to Yishir Tavern for some seafood." Fan Ruoruo was angry. She snatched the map back. It's done? What's done? Do you know how big of a deal this is? No, I'm going to tell father. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He thought to himself that the concept of the inviolability of the emperor's power was indeed deeply ingrained in people's hearts. Of course, he also understood that his sister was mainly worried about his safety and the children of the manor. If others knew that he had secretly drawn a map of the royal palace, given the relationship between the Fan manor and the royal family, it would probably be very tragic. Don't worry, I'll rest in a bit. I'll immediately memorize this map and then burn it. No one will know. Fan Xian smiled and comforted his sister. Tears welled up in Fan Ruoruo's eyes. Brother, why did you draw this picture? Fan Xian sighed and lowered his head to look into his sister's eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, because there is something I want in the royal palace. You want to go to the palace to steal? Fan Ruoruo was so surprised that she wanted to scream, but she quickly covered her mouth. Fan Xian said seriously, correct, but I didn't steal it. That thing was mine to begin with. Fan Ruoruo shook off her shock and immediately recovered her usual calm and intelligence. She deduced the truth of the matter and lowered her trembling voice. Does it have something to do with... Eh? Fan Xian smiled. I can't hide this from you. It was a few simple words, but they were filled with the trust between brother and sister. He continued to smile. It doesn't matter. What kind of person is your brother? He punched a 7-year-old child and kicked an old man in his 70s. He stood on an unmarked grave and roared. If you don't believe me, come out. But no one dared to make a sound. Ruoruo laughed with some difficulty. She didn't think her brother's joke was funny, but she was still worried. She knew that Fan Xian looked beautiful and gentle, but in reality, his heart was exceptionally hard and cold. She couldn't persuade him, so she could only let him be and pray at home every day. Actually, I'm very selfish. Fan Xian looked at the worry on her brow and suddenly calmed himself. Every time there's something I can't bear alone, I'm willing to tell you. It looks like I trust you, but in reality I just want to find someone to share the pressure with. But I never thought that this kind of pressure is actually a greater pain for you. At least I still have you to talk to. Who can you talk to? For example, my mother is the mistress of the Yi family, or I'm about to go to the palace to steal something. Ruoruo looked at him with a trace of worry. Trust and pressure cancel each other out. I still like that you don't hide things from me. The negotiations were still going on. The work of redrawing the border was very difficult. Originally, with the support of Fan Xian's analysis of the case, the official in charge of the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple of Qin was unusually tough. Several times he almost forced the Northern Qi envoys to sign their names on the documents. But for some reason, perhaps because something had happened in Northern Qi, the Northern Qi envoys shamelessly and even hysterically dragged on, as if they were waiting for something. This smell of conspiracy was immediately picked up by the experienced vice minister of the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple, Xan Chiwu. That afternoon, after a fruitless negotiation, he held a small teapot and looked at Fan Xian, indicating for him to follow him out. Along the way there were officials who paid their respects to the two envoys. With great difficulty they found a quiet place. Xan Chiwu sighed tiredly. Master Fan, do you feel that something is amiss? Regarding this negotiation, although Fan Xian had the correct attitude of observing and learning, he had participated from start to finish, and so he felt that the change in attitude of the Northern Qi envoys was a little strange. But if they had recently obtained a bargaining chip to rely on, it should have been laid out by now. There was no way they were still dragging on the negotiation table like a scoundrel. He thought for a moment and suddenly frowned. I'm afraid that Northern Qi is now thinking of a way to obtain a bargaining chip to use on the negotiation table. Xan Chiwu looked at him and nodded. I think so too. So tonight, I will enter the palace to see His Majesty and ask His Majesty to issue an edict ordering the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council to assist the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple. If I don't find out what Northern Qi is thinking, I won't be able to rest easy. Fan Xian leaned against the railing and narrowed his eyes and thought. What did Northern Qi want? Unreasonably, he thought of the Overwatch Council's spy network in Northern Qi, and of Yan Bingyun who had been hiding in Northern Qi for 4 years. Xan Chiwu didn't know what Fan Xian was thinking, but he said calmly, I will enter the palace tonight, but I won't be able to obtain much on the surface. Deputy Fan, you can no longer hide your abilities. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Xan Chiwu must have thought that his father had secretly helped him obtain the dossier. But the heavens knew that his father had secretly helped the emperor manage a power that even he had never come into contact with. But after thinking about it, he felt that he really needed to ask. At the very least, he needed to ensure Yan Bingyun's safety in northern Qi. That night, in the hidden courtyard, Fan Xian summoned Wang Qinian and told him about his and Xan Qiwu's concerns. Wang Qinian's reaction gave Fan Xian an ominous feeling. The council hasn't received a greeting from the crows for 8 days. Wang Qinian's brows were tightly furrowed. This kind of information shouldn't be available to someone of your level. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. But I'm not going to ask you how you know. I just want you to remind the council to be careful in northern Qi. Wang Qinian shook his head. It's all one-way communication. If it's broken, it'll be hard to get it back. Besides, Yan Bingyun is the head spy of northern Qi. If something happens to him, there'll be no point in contacting him again. No matter what, we have to remind him to be careful. A cold light flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. He didn't like giving up on anyone for the sake of the country, especially Yan Bingyun. As the son of a high-ranking official, he had been undercover for 4 years and had sacrificed much. Fan Xian now saw himself as a part of the kingdom of Qing and the Overwatch Council. Naturally, he felt a kind of admiration for Yan Bingyun, whom he had never met. Fan Xian was thinking of something else. He looked at Wang Qinian calmly. I have a mission, but I can't go through the council. I hope I can ask for your help. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian, confused. You can't tell Director Qin. Fan Xian's tone was calm, but Wang Qinian could hear the coldness in it. Yes. As soon as he said this, Wang Qinian knew that he had bet his life on this seemingly gentle, but actually ruthless, young man. As for the council, Director Qin had only told him to listen to Fan Xian and nothing else. That night, the unfortunate news was finally confirmed. The spy network of the 4th Bureau of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council in northern Qi had fortunately been largely preserved. But to everyone's surprise, as the head of the spy network, Yan Bingyun, had been captured alive by northern Qi's internal experts in a silk shop in Shangjing. For such an incident, it was usually broken through from the lower levels, and then traced back to the top. It was rare for someone at the top of the spy network to be captured in one fell swoop. For such a situation to occur, there was only one possibility. Someone in the upper levels of the kingdom of Qing had colluded with a foreign country. Of course, the news of Yan Bingyun's capture could not be spread. Although that would be a blow to the kingdom of Qing's reputation, it would be even more detrimental to northern Qi's interests. Northern Qi needed such a leader in exchange for corresponding benefits, not just to strike at the enemy's morale. As for the Qing bureaucracy, the eldest son of Yan Ruohai, the head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had died 4 years ago. No one knew that he had been sent to northern Qi by the royal court. In the past few days, no one who knew about this had been able to sleep well. In the most secret room of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, Vice Minister Xang closed his eyes and handed a piece of paper to Fan Xian. Fan Xian took it and looked at it. It was a painting of a thin cloud flying high above the icy plains. During the negotiations that day, an unremarkable figure in the Northern Qi diplomatic mission had secretly handed it to Vice Minister Xan. At the time, the expression on that person's face had almost provoked Vice Minister Xan to draw his guard sword and strike him. The 2 words Bingyun were hidden in the painting. It seemed that the Northern Qi diplomatic mission had received the news and were preparing to make an offer. Chapter 133. There really is a traitor. Fan Xian and Xan both opened their mouths at the same time, and then shut their mouths at the same time. Both of them believed that the head spy of Northern Qi was not a weakling who would speak under torture. Since he could so easily capture Yan Bingyun and learn his real name, it was clear that someone hidden in the Qing court had some sort of agreement with Northern Qi. Xan shook his head. Before this, even the Crown Prince and I did not know that Yan Bingyun had gone to Northern Qi. I think that there are no more than 5 people in the court who have the right to know about this. Even a fool would not believe that they had betrayed the country. There are always benefits to betraying the country, and in reality the entire Qing kingdom is run by His Majesty. What benefits could there be from betraying the country? Fan Xian and Xan looked at each other and saw the worry in each other's eyes. Both of them thought of a frightening possibility. What if it wasn't a traitor? What if it was a ploy by some official to attack the Overwatch Council? Fan Xian thought back to when Wang Qinian had told him about Yan Bingyun, and he had felt it was strange. How did he know? Was the Overwatch Council so confident in their own internal control? Only later did he realize that Chen Pingping had told him through Wang Qinian. But he still felt some lingering fear. If the news had leaked from his side, he would not be able to escape death. Could there be such a crazy person? For the sake of a power struggle in the court, they would trample on the interests of the entire Qing kingdom. Xan shook his head with a bitter smile. Fan Xian shook his head as well. Thinking of his trip to the palace, he knew that there were many such madmen in the kingdom of Qing. He composed himself and asked, assuming that Yan Bingyun has been captured, what will His Majesty do? Northern Qi underestimated His Majesty's determination. When Vice Minister Xan thought of the lofty Son of Heaven, he immediately felt emboldened and said, I will not yield even an inch of the territory that I have occupied. Fan Xian was surprised. What about Yan Bingyun? Exchange? Xan's expression was sinister. Exchange prisoners. His Majesty has made up his mind. The previous prisoner exchange agreement will be cancelled and a new one will be drafted. All we need to do is wait for Northern Qi to send Yan Bingyun's token for confirmation. After that, a new round of prisoner exchange negotiations will begin. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, Northern Qi thinks they're holding a big fish, so they probably won't agree. This time, we will send 2 more people back to Northern Qi, Vice-Chancellor Xan said coldly. If Northern Qi is still unwilling, in 3 months in the early winter the Emperor will behead Northern Qi, capture the heads of 1,000 people, send them back to Northern Qi and the army will rise again. Using power to suppress others can be considered a helpless move. I'm just afraid that Northern Qi will also fight to the death. There are 3,000 captives on both sides. No matter how much they kill, it will be useless. Fan Xian's hand lightly slapped the desk, and a strange thought suddenly welled up in his mind. Who are the 2 people preparing to join in the exchange of prisoners? Can Northern Qi agree? One is Xiao En, who has been locked up for 20 years. Xan Shaoqing looked at him warmly, knowing that this young man did not know Xiao En's name. This man was the head spy of Northern Wei. Before the second Northern Expedition, Director Qin of the Overwatch Council and Master Fei personally led the Black Knights and captured Xiao En alive on the day of his son's wedding. After he was captured, the Northern Wei spy network was like a group of dragons without a leader, and became a pile of loose sand. When the Emperor personally led the expedition, he was able to break through like a hot knife through butter, and beat a huge empire into its current weak state. Later, when the merit was discussed, the Overwatch Council was awarded the highest merit. At the time, we young scholars all believed that if Xiao En had not been so bold as to leave Shangjing of Northern Qi to attend his son's wedding, the imperial court would not have been able to capture him, and the subsequent battles would not have gone so smoothly. Hearing this story from decades ago, Fan Xian sighed and was speechless. He listened to Xan Shaoqing's last words. Of course, Xiao En was bold enough to leave Shangjing. Director Qin was even bolder, daring to enter 800 li into enemy territory. Although he paid the price of a pair of legs, he still managed to capture Xiao En. Before that, Xiao En of Northern Wei and Qin Pingping of Southern Qing were known to the world as the most fearsome dark ministers. After Xiao En was captured alive by Director Qin, naturally no one dared to compare him to him. Fan Xian listened with yearning. So that was how the old cripple's legs were broken. He had never imagined that Qin Pingping had such a heroic side to him. Exchanging Xiao En for Yan Bingyun. He thought for a moment, then judged purely from reason. It seems we are at a disadvantage. Last night, several ministers thought so too. Xan Shaoqing looked at him with a smile. But the Emperor and Director Qin did not think so. After all, Xiao En is already 70 years old, and once he was defeated by Director Qin, he naturally could not regain his former glory. Master Yan endured humiliation and hid in enemy territory for 4 years, and his contributions were self-evident. Exchanging an old man for the future of the kingdom of Qing, what is wrong with that? Fan Xian nodded and asked curiously, were you afraid that Northern Qi would not agree? Who else did they add? That woman was a request of Northern Qi in the past, so His Majesty simply agreed. Xan Shaoqing looked at Fan Xian and suddenly laughed. I heard that the Emperor of Northern Qi was very fond of that woman. It seems that in the future, Master Fan, you have already made the young Emperor of Northern Qi a cuckold. Fan Xian's expression was a little strange. Could it be Sea Lily? The negotiations were always divided into 2 parts. On the surface, the ministers of the Kingdom of Qing and the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi deliberated over every word at the negotiating table. Every title and every word displayed a certain kind of morbid stubbornness. Only in this way could the face of the Kingdom of Qing be preserved, and not be weakened in the final letter of credence. So every day Honglu Temple was always noisy, with people banging on tables and trampling on chairs. It did not seem like 2 countries were negotiating, but more like shrews in a wet market cursing each other. The other part of the negotiations was much colder and more direct. There were no officials from the Chamberlain of Dependencies present, and Northern Qi was not the leader of the diplomatic mission. Instead, they were hidden in the dark and had the power to speak. Yen Ruahai, the head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, was a well-known figure in the upper echelons of the capital, where officials were like roaming carp. He coldly signed the secret agreement for the exchange of prisoners and did not look at the document again. On the agreement was the name of his own son. He could have resigned from the negotiations, but he had insisted on coming to take a look. The unremarkable official from Northern Qi smiled and signed. He looked at Yen Ruahai and said quietly, "Do not worry, Master Yen. Your son is doing very well in this country." Yen Ruahai said expressionlessly, "Today I wanted to see how clever my colleagues in the north were to be able to capture the little brat that I raised. But when I saw you, an idiot, I knew what was going on." The official did not fly into a rage. He only coldly retorted, "Master Yen, do not be too harsh with your words. You must know that your son is still in our hands. If we are idiots, then what is your son? And what are you?" Yen Ruahai laughed coldly. He got up and walked out the door. "The problem is, my son was not captured by you." Outside the door, Qin Pingping looked at him from his wheelchair and shook his head. "You have been in this position for too long. You are no longer as tolerant as you were." "I can tolerate many things, but I cannot tolerate arrows shot from the back." It was clear that Yen Ruahai respected his superior very much. He slowly pushed Qin Pingping's wheelchair and walked to a quiet place. Qin Pingping sat in his wheelchair and raised a finger. "In the court, who knows how many people want to die for you and me? This time we can trade Xiaoen for Bingyun. Next time I will not have someone like Xiaoen in my hands." Yen Ruahai replied, "There will not be a next time. We must hurry and find that person," Qin Pingping said. Qin Pingping said, "This time His Majesty is standing on our side, because he clearly knows that some noble person wants to teach us a lesson. But I do not like the feeling of being provoked." "Yes, Director." Yen Ruahai knew that his old superior would think of a way to deal with this matter, so he was not in a hurry. Although the prisoner exchange may not go smoothly, as long as Bingyun does not die, it will be a trial for the young. It is not necessarily a bad thing. That makes sense. So I have decided to let a young man go and temper himself. It won't take too long, just a few months. A few months? Is it about the diplomatic mission to Northern Qi? Correct. And we must bring Yen Bingyun back in one piece. I hope he can handle it well. Who is it? Before I leave, I will let the 8 bureaus meet with him. Everything proceeded smoothly. After the kingdom of Qing paid a considerable price, the two sides came to an agreement on the exchange of prisoners and spies. Everyone was happy. The kingdom of Qing gained face and territory. Northern Qi gained face, Xiaoen, and the woman the emperor liked. Only the envoy from Dongyi remained in the courtyard. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about him. The kingdom of Qing was deliberately giving the other side the cold shoulder, using the incident at the foot of the Tsang Mountains to extort more money. Dongyi was the gathering place of the world's largest merchants. Long before the kingdom of Qing opened the southern ports, they had begun trading with foreigners. Although they only had Sigujian and martial arts, their financial resources were inexhaustible. 3 days later, the emperor of Qing would hold a banquet for the two countries' envoys. As the deputy envoy, Fan Xian naturally had to attend the banquet in the palace. It would be his second time entering the palace, and it would also be the night he had planned. He carefully prepared everything in his room, but occasionally his eyes would glance at the black leather suitcase peeking out from under his bed. In the past few days of official business, he had seen something more deeply. The kingdom of Qing appeared to be powerful and insufferably arrogant, but because of the unspeakable thoughts of certain nobles in the court, there was still so much filth and darkness. The royal family was ruthless, but not necessarily to the members of the royal family. More to the subjects of the world. Fan Xian knew very well that even if the emperor knew who wanted to deal with his own secret service, he would not actually kill them because those people could be his wife, his sister, his son, or even his mother. Be a person who thinks only for yourself. This was something Fan Xian had reminded himself countless times since coming to this world. His eyes gradually grew cold. He hid the slender dagger and carefully inserted the 3 poison-soaked needles into his hair. Chapter 134. 3 days later, ceremonial music was played. Red lanterns were hung high, and an endless stream of guests came and went. It was a splendid scene of prosperity. The Northern Qi diplomatic mission and the Dongyi guests were welcomed by the kingdom of Qing. Their faces were full of smiles as they walked along the long passageway into the most solemn palace of the kingdom of Qing. Looking at the expressions of the three parties, it seemed that the world was at peace, and that the battles and assassinations of the past few days had never happened. The location of the banquet was Qinian Hall in the outer city of the palace. The palace maids who carried food and wine to and fro in front of the table were very beautiful. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and smiled as he watched them bustle about in the grand palace. The palace maids noticed that the young and handsome Fan Xian was looking at them in a different light, and they couldn't help but feel a little shy. Their faint blush grew even redder, and they stole glances at him from time to time. The distinguished guests gathered in front of the hall, but not a single sound could be heard. Many of the kingdom of Qing's guests were ministers and nobles that Fan Xian had never seen before. Only Director Qin and the Prime Minister were absent due to illness. Across from him sat the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi and the diplomatic mission of Dongyi. Although Fan Xian's position was low, he was also a deputy, so he was arranged to sit in the middle of the table. Beside him were some senior officials and he couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. At that moment, he heard an old man next to him say with a smile, "There are many rules at the banquet, but His Majesty has always been easygoing. Don't be nervous, Master Fan." This old man was Zhang Ziqian, an assistant minister of the Board of Rites. Because Fan Xian had an unresolvable grudge against the Guo family of the Board of Rites, he was secretly wary of this man. But hearing his words, he didn't seem to have any ill intentions. Fan Xian couldn't help but smile shamefully. "I've lived in the countryside all my life. I've never seen such a grand occasion. If I've been disrespectful in any way, I hope you can point me out." Zhang Ziqian stroked his long beard and smiled. Ren Shaoqing said in court today that Master Fan had contributed greatly to this negotiation. At this time, no one in court will do anything to you. Just be careful of those people across from you. The two of them looked across and saw Chang Ningho of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission waiting, bored out of his mind. The table in front of them was still empty. Presumably, it was occupied by the elusive Zhuang Mohan. At the head of the Dongyi envoys sat a middle-aged man with a sword strapped to his waist. Fan Xian couldn't help but frown. How could he enter the palace with a sword? His Majesty has personally approved it. The disciples of Sigu Sword School never leave their swords. This is a special case, Zhang Ziqian explained in detail as if he were explaining to a junior. He is Sigu Sword's first disciple, Yun Jilan? Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and narrowed his eyes. Immediately, he felt a murderous intent naturally emanating from the sword-bearing man. These days, the Qing court had deliberately given the Dongyi envoys the cold shoulder. It seemed that this ninth-level swordsman Yun Jilan was not in a good mood. Even sitting in the palace of the Qing kingdom, his entire person was still cold. Fan Xian was looking at Yun Jilan's sword-like brows. Coincidentally, Yun Jilan was also looking at him. Their gazes met like lightning in the air of the palace. A moment later, Fan Xian lowered his head in a show of weakness and gently coughed. The sword intent in his opponent's gaze was too strong. This exchange of glances immediately drew the attention of everyone in the hall. Everyone knew that Fan Xian had killed 2 female disciples of Sigu Sword School on Yolan Street, and that Dongyi had come to pay tribute to clean up the aftermath of that incident. But according to most people's opinions, this swordsman Yun Jilan would not mind killing Fan Xian with his sword. Fortunately, the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace had expressed some goodwill towards Fan Xian through negotiations over personnel arrangements. Thus, no one in the court, regardless of which faction, dared to take pleasure in Fan Xian's misfortune because of this. With a foreign enemy in front of them, all the officials of the Qing kingdom as well as those in the military glared fiercely at Yun Jilan. The atmosphere in the entire palace suddenly became tense. Fan Xian's face was expressionless. He lowered his head and adjusted the jinqi in his body, ready at any moment. At this moment, the faint sound of a zither came from the side of the palace. Amidst the solemn palace music, a eunuch loudly shouted, "His Majesty has arrived." The most powerful man in the world, the only master of the Qing kingdom, the emperor, accompanied by the empress, slowly approached from the side. With a warm smile on his face, he stood in front of the dragon throne. "Long live the emperor! Long live the emperor!" The officials in front of the hall knelt down respectfully and the guests of the diplomatic mission bowed. The remaining tension in the hall was replaced by an inexplicable sense of solemnity and respect. The emperor sat high above, accompanied by the empress. The crown prince also had a unique seat 2 steps below his parents. Normally, the other princes would not come to such an occasion. The emperor's gaze swept across the officials below. "You may rise," he said warmly. He bowed and rose, and the feast officially began. First, the officials of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission stepped forward. They sang their praises as usual, proclaiming the traditional friendship between the two countries, and then retreated. Yun Jilan of Dongyi stepped forward, expressionlessly said a few words, and then also retreated. The empress smiled and whispered in His Majesty's ear, "This man from Dongyi is quite arrogant." The emperor and empress sat high above. Their conversation could not be overheard, so they spoke directly. His Majesty also smiled warmly. "If the first disciple of Sigusor did not have the slightest bit of arrogance, I'm afraid he would not even have the courage to hold a sword in my room." The palace maids had long since replaced the hot dishes. The officials buried their heads in their food, not daring to speak. Since His Majesty did not speak, it was naturally quiet. Fan Xian lowered his head in discomfort, but his eyes were undetectable as he glanced at the seat opposite him. The previously empty seat was now occupied by a man. His face was old, but his eyes were clear and spirited. The wrinkles on his forehead seemed to contain a great deal of wisdom. His white robes wrapped around his not-so-tall body like a cloud. Without asking, he knew that this was Zhuang Mohan of Northern Qi. Fan Xian did not know when he had sat down, but he guessed that he had entered at the same time as the emperor. It seemed that the rumors were true. This Zhuang Mohan was greatly appreciated by the Empress Dowager. Perhaps he had been in the palace all this time. When Fan Xian stole a glance at the man, he did not know that the high and mighty couple were also looking at him. The Empress took a sip of wine and indicated where Fan Xian was sitting with her eyes. "That young man is Fan Xian, Princess Chen's future son-in-law," she said quietly. His Majesty smiled. "He looks handsome and he has some fame in the capital." At court today, Xan Qiwu and Ren Xiao, and the two vice ministers, both praised his talent. "I am truly curious as to why the Crown Prince's servant and the Prime Minister's student are so friendly to him." The Empress's smile was a bit forced. Perhaps the Crown Prince understands the importance of popularity? Besides, he is soon to be the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Oh, popularity? His Majesty smiled faintly. He did not look at the Empress. Instead he looked at his son. "It seems that my son also understands the importance of popularity." Although she could hear a trace of dissatisfaction in his voice, the Empress still felt that His Majesty was in a good mood today. He was not only willing to berate the Crown Prince, but also had some positive comments. She could not help but say happily, "Chengchen is growing up. He will understand some things." His Majesty smiled wordlessly. After a while, Fan Xian kept drinking, perhaps because he was nervous or for some other reason. This wine was at most a type of millet wine. It was not very strong and tasted sweet and sour. Fan Xian did not think much of it, but in the eyes of the officials next to him, the way this young man drank was like that of a fierce animal. Even the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Zhang Ziqian, could not help but remind him, "Sir Fan, don't drink too much. If you make a faux pas in front of His Majesty, that would be a great crime." Hearing the words Sir Fan, he knew that Zhang Ziqian was reminding him that this was not Lujing River, but deep in the palace. He was not a guest but an official. Fan Xian smiled inwardly, but his jinchi reversed, forcing the drunkenness onto his face. His eyes suddenly became a bit hazy. He lowered his voice and said, "I dare not hide it from you, sir. I'm really nervous. Why don't I quickly drink some wine and relax a bit?" Zhang Ziqian looked at Fan Xian's drunken state, as if he could not hear him clearly. He could only shake his head and smile bitterly. "The Prime Minister claimed to be ill and did not come, and your father did not come either. Instead he left you in my care. If you really get drunk, how am I supposed to explain it to them?" These days, the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi had been put in a difficult position by the diplomatic officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. Seeing Fan Xian's state, they could not help but look at each other and make up their minds. These days, although Fan Xian was the deputy, he had been silent. But the diplomatic mission deeply disliked the mischievous look on his beautiful face. Northern Qi still had many spies in the capital of the Kingdom of Qin. Of course, they knew that the reason the Chamberlain of Dependencies was so powerful this time was all because of the bad ideas of the deputy, Fan Xian. As for what those bad ideas were, no one knew. Now that the negotiations between the two countries had been completed, and the royal families of both sides had signed their names, there was no way to go back on their word. But the Northern Qi diplomatic mission still had a big knot in their hearts. Seeing Fan Xian's drunken state, Chang Ningho smiled sinisterly. He stood up and respectfully bowed to the high ground. Your Majesty, these days the negotiations between the two sides have been tiring. The people of the Chamberlain of Dependencies have also been tiring. I wonder if I could offer a toast to the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, to show the friendship between our two countries? When Chang Ningho spoke, the diplomatic mission of Dongyi sat next to them. Naturally, they saw Fan Xian's drunken state and knew what the Northern Qi people wanted to do. They only looked on coldly, not joining in the fun. The dragon chair was too high, and the Emperor and the Empress did not seem to see the undercurrent of the situation. Naturally, they did not notice Fan Xian and laughed. The Crown Prince also joined in the fun. Chang Ningho naturally wants to enjoy himself to the fullest. Opponents on the battlefield, friends off the battlefield? And of course at the wine table we are only opponents. The Crown Prince actually just wanted to show off his conversational skills, but they were quite ordinary and he did not know how things would develop. This worried the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. In these days of negotiations, everyone had long since regarded Deputy Fan as one of their own. How could they let the Northern Qi people get Deputy Fan drunk? But the two sides were sitting far apart and there was no way to help. Fan Xian smiled and drank with the Northern Qi diplomatic mission, but he felt a faint sense of unease. In recent days, the merchants under the control of the eldest princess had begun to act against Danbo bookstore, raising the price of paper and lowering the price of books. These two simple moves were enough to make Fan Xizha and the 7th Yi shopkeeper very depressed. But Fan Xian knew that the real tricks were still to come. And what he was going to do today required the help of wine. It was difficult not to get drunk, but it was even more difficult to pretend to be drunk. This was the strongest feeling Fan Xian had during his first court banquet. Northern Qi could not hold on any longer. 6 of the 8 ambassadors had fallen, and in the end even Chang Ningho no longer cared about his status and bravely sacrificed himself, half hanging from Fan Xian's arm. Up until now the Emperor, who had been quietly talking with the Empress and Zhuang Mohan, smiled. The palace has not been this lively in a long time. Zhuang Mohan had been silent the entire time, and only occasionally would the Emperor ask him a few questions in a quiet voice. He had the air of a famous scholar. Following the Emperor's gaze, he seemed to have just noticed the commotion. Looking at the beautiful young man holding Chang Ningho and pouring wine down his throat, he asked curiously, "That young man is Master Fan of the House of Poets?" This world-famous literary master seemed to find it hard to believe his own eyes. The legendary young scholar who won the fame of poetry with just 3 poems turned out to be a drunkard. The Emperor seemed to be slightly annoyed and raised his voice. Fan Xian. Everyone in the palace was paying close attention to the movements on the throne, for fear of a moment of carelessness. Therefore when the Emperor spoke the entire palace quieted down. Not a single sound could be heard except for the young man called Fan Xian who was still shouting, "Victory! Victory!" That seemed to be a southern saying. It seemed that young Master Fan really had drunk too much. Fan Xian. Seeing that the young man was drunk, the Crown Prince could not help but rebuke him, suppressing his anger. After all, it was the Eastern Palace who had suggested Fan Xian as a deputy, and it was because of this that Fan Xian had the right to enter the palace that day. Fan Xian had lost face, and in the Crown Prince's heart, the Crown Prince felt that he had lost face. As if sensing the strange silence in the palace, Fan Xian stood where he was in a daze. His eyes swept around in a daze, but his beautiful face showed the freedom of drunkenness. "Who's calling me?" All the officials in the court who were on good terms with the Fan family and the Prime Minister wanted nothing more than to gag his mouth, shove him into a carriage and throw him back to Fan Manor. To everyone's surprise, the high and mighty Emperor did not seem angry after hearing this response, which could only be heard in a restaurant. Instead he laughed. "I'm calling you." Hearing the word "I" woke up people regardless of whether they were really drunk or pretending to be drunk. Fan Xian was no exception. He loosened his grip and hurriedly bowed. I deserve to die. I drank too much." As he loosened his grip, Chang Ningho of Northern Qi, who had been choked by him, went limp and fell to the ground with a thud. The Qing official, seeing the enemy's chief negotiator in such a sorry state, smiled with satisfaction. The only 2 Northern Qi ambassadors who were not drunk hurriedly helped Chang Ningho back to his seat. A palace maid considerately brought him some soup to sober him up. The Emperor reprimanded him. "Of course I know you drank too much. Otherwise I would have punished you for your lack of etiquette." Fan Xian struggled to maintain his bowed posture. He smiled bitterly and defended himself. I dare not defend myself, but it is a pleasure to have guests from afar. If I do not properly entertain these important people from northern Qi, as the deputy envoy, I cannot help but fail in my duty. His Majesty turned to the Empress. He still dares not defend himself. If he did, I'm afraid he would say that I made him drink and that he had nothing to do with it. The Empress knew that His Majesty had always loved Princess Chen. She didn't know if he loved her because of her. She smiled. Since she didn't speak up for Fan Xian, she wasn't stupid enough to rebuke him. Fan Xian. This was the third time His Majesty had called out his name in the palace. The officials listened attentively, but in their hearts they felt something else. It seemed that the relationship between the Fan family and the royal family was not ordinary. His Majesty spoke lightly. The relationship between the Fan family and me is not ordinary. In my eyes you are only a junior. Regardless of whether we are monarch or official, when I speak, you should keep your sharp tongue shut. Don't think I don't know what you said in the restaurant. At such a young age, do you really think you can look down on the people of this world just because you have a sharp tongue? His Majesty was clearly denouncing him, but he was secretly protecting him. The officials and emissaries were not fools. They understood. As expected, His Majesty spoke quietly. On this late summer night, the monarch and his officials are in harmony, and the friendship between the two nations is strong. Fan Xian, you have always been famous for your poetry. Why don't you compose a poem? The officials all agreed, knowing that His Majesty was giving face to the Fan family. It seemed that His Majesty had a stroke of inspiration. He wanted to use today's banquet as an opportunity to let the officials know what kind of person this 8th-rank functionary of the Fan family was. His Majesty wanted to give Fan Xian a great opportunity to make a name for himself, but Fan Xian was half drunk. He was afraid that he would waste this opportunity. Was a pity? Fan Xian was indeed a little tipsy, but he had clearly heard the conversation in front of the palace. He laughed at himself and bowed in the direction of the dragon throne. Your Majesty, I only know how to make a fool of myself in front of the great Zhuang Mohan. As soon as he said this, the officials all looked at Zhuang Mohan. Only now did they understand what His Majesty meant. He was not just giving Fan Xian a chance to make a name for himself. He wanted to use this opportunity to prove to the people of this world that in terms of martial arts, the kingdom of Qing was unparalleled. In terms of writing, the kingdom of Qing also had a talent that could rival Zhuang Mohan. Fan Xian's name, 10,000 miles sorrowful in autumn, always a guest, had been ringing in the capital for months. It was only after he had insisted on not composing poetry that the name gradually faded. Hearing him push the blame to Zhuang Mohan, the officials thought that he and His Majesty had long since secretly planned to strike a blow at the arrogance of the literary world of northern Qi. In reality, Fan Xian was only guessing. His experience from his previous life was not enough for him to guess the emperor's heart. But seeing the flourishing style of writing in the kingdom of Qing, it seemed that His Majesty was not satisfied that he was undefeatable on the battlefield, and that he had always been viewed as a southern barbarian by the people of northern Qi. After Zhuang Mohan came to the kingdom, he entered and left the palace. Although the Empress Dowager and the other ladies respected him for his literary reputation, His Majesty would probably feel very uncomfortable. Unfortunately, the kingdom of Qing had no literary masters, and so Fan Xian, a plagiarist, had been innocently pushed onto the stage. Fan Xian knew he had not guessed the emperor's meaning incorrectly. Even from a distance, his powerful eyesight could still see clearly that the emperor's eyes gradually narrowed. There was a glimmer of admiration in the depth of his gaze. This admiration, of course, was for Sir Fan Jr.'s understanding of the emperor's heart. At the same time, it was a warning to compose a good poem and not lose face for the kingdom of Qing in front of Zhuang Mohan. Why don't you compose a poem and let Mr. Zhuang Mohan evaluate it? If it's not good, you will be punished by drinking wine. The Empress smiled. She knew what the man beside her was thinking, so she made preparations in advance. Now that things had come to this, what else could they do? Fan Xian returned to the table. Not caring that he was already drunk, he poured another cup and savored the slightly sour wine in his mouth. His brows were tightly furrowed. All the officials knew that Master Fan was eager for talent, so they secretly counted on his behalf. When he counted to about 15, a clear light appeared in Fan Xian's eyes. His face was full of smiles. His lips parted slightly as he recited, drinking and singing, how long is life? Take the morning dew for example, the bitter days that go by. Indigo color, leisurely in my heart. But for the sake of the monarch, I have been groaning to this day. I have guessed to play the flute and the flute. Clearly like the moon, when will it disappear? At the banquet, the heart remembers old favors. The moon is bright and the stars are sparse, the crows fly south, circling the tree 3 times, where can they rest? The mountains are not too high, the sea is not too deep. The Duke of Zhou spits out, the world returns to its heart. Just like every time Fan Xian threw out a poem to beat people, this poem made the entire hall quiet. This was the masterpiece of Grandmaster Chao. Fan Xian had deleted a few lines and tossed it out. In this hall, the world returns to its heart, just in line with the emperor's thoughts. The most amazing thing was that the Duke of Zhou spits out actually existed in this world. Furthermore, this Duke of Zhou was not a follower of the emperor, but an actual emperor. That was why Fan Xian dared to write it out so grandly. After a long time in the Grand Palace, all the officials cheered in unison, "Good poem." The emperor showed a satisfied expression and turned to look at Zhuang Mohan. "What does Master Zhuang think of this poem?" he asked quietly. Zhuang Mohan's expression did not change. He did not know how many times he had experienced such a scene in his life, nor how many poems he had appraised. The reason he was respected by all the people, even the emperor and other officials of the kingdom of Qin, had read his essays and entered officialdom was because of his virtue and insight. Of course, the most important thing was his vast knowledge. "Good poem," Zhuang Mohan said quietly. He picked up a peanut with his chopsticks and ate it. "It is indeed a good poem. Although the meaning is broken, it wins in its quality. For poetry, the meaning comes first and quality is the most important. Master Fan's poem is full of quality, and it is indeed a good poem. Who would have thought that the kingdom of Qin could produce such a talent?" Fan Xian smiled slightly. He did not have any special feelings for this master of the literary world, but he did not like his style. After a slight bow, he returned to his seat, but his steps were a little shaky. The officials in the court were still whispering about Sir Fan Jr.'s earlier poem. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the end of the matter, but the atmosphere in the hall seemed a little strange today. One person said coldly, "What Master Zhuang said earlier about the kingdom of Qin was inappropriate. Everyone knows that you are a master of writing. But in terms of poetry you are not necessarily as good as Master Fan, so there is no need to make presumptuous comments. There are many scholars in this court and Master Fan is one of the best. Not to mention that he wrote a poem in 15 minutes, just the poem, 10,000 Li of Sorrowful Autumn is Always a Guest is enough. I truly do not know, in the kingdom of Northern Qi, which scholar could write such a poem." These words were very inappropriate, especially at a national banquet. It was abnormally rude. The emperor of Qin had not expected a common literary matter to reach this stage. The emperor's brows gradually furrowed. He did not know which official had been so rude, but this person was, after all, feeling injustice for the court, and there was no way to punish him. Fan Xian stopped on his way back to the banquet, and bowed apologetically to Zhuang Mohan to show that he had not intended to be disrespectful. Zhuang Mohan coughed twice, and with some difficulty, stood up with the help of a young eunuch whom the Empress Dowager had pointed out to him. He looked calmly at Fan Xian. "Master Fan's poetry has long spread to Shangjing of the kingdom of Qi. I have often recited that 10,000 Li of Sorrowful Autumn is always a guest." Fan Xian suddenly saw a trace of pity in the eyes of this master of literature, a trace of decisiveness that cut off all avenues of retreat. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He felt some danger that he had not been aware of, slowly approaching him. He was getting tipsy, but he still turned his head abruptly, and behind the banquet table, he found the face that had started the fight. Guo Baoquan. Guo Baoquan, who had been punched by Fan Xian. Guo Baoquan, the crown prince's close aide. Guo Baoquan was also qualified to sit at the banquet table today. But it was clear that the crown prince had not known about this beforehand. So the crown prince and Fan Xian both narrowed their eyes, looking at Guo Baoquan's faintly smug face, unsure of what he wanted to do. Fan Xian felt the danger and smiled slightly. At that moment he heard Zhuang Mohan cough twice, and after bowing to the emperor he said quietly, "I am of the kingdom of Qi, but my heart is in the literature of the world. I do not wish to harm the friendship between the two countries, but there are some things that must be said." His Majesty's expression gradually calmed and he calmly said, "Master Zhuang, please speak." As His Majesty spoke, the Empress also raised her wine cup, opened her mouth to speak and then pulled it back. "The wind is urgent, the ape howls in sorrow, the white bird flies back on the clear sand. Boundless falling trees rustle down, the endless great river rolls in. 10,000 Li of sorrowful autumn is always a guest, 100 years of illness alone on the stage. Hardship and bitterness hate the thick frost on the temples, the destitute new wine cup stops. The palace was incomparably quiet. No one knew what this master of literature, whose name had shaken the world, would say. The first 4 lines of this poem are excellent. Chapter 135. Hearing the last line, the officials were puzzled. This poem had appeared in the capital in the spring, and had long since spread throughout the land. Aside from the words, "Great River," which were somewhat uncomfortable to read, many poets had always thought that there was nothing to nitpick about the poem. But the essence of the poem was in the last 4 lines, and they did not know why Zhuang Mohan had said so. Zhuang Mohan said coldly, "The reason why I say the first 4 lines are good is not because the last 4 lines are bad, but because the last 4 lines were not written by Master Fan." As soon as these words were said, there was an uproar in the hall, and then a deathly silence. No one spoke. Fan Xian pretended to be surprised, but he understood many things. He calmed down, and his drunken body leaned against the table, smiling at Zhuang Mohan. A few months ago, Lin Wanner had said that someone in the palace said that his poem was copied. At the time he did not care, but he did not expect it to explode today. Guo Baoquan had clearly been instructed by some noble to stir up this matter. After he entered the capital, the only thing he could use was his so-called literary reputation. If she completely destroyed his reputation, in a world where literature and virtue were highly valued, he would have no choice but to break off the engagement. After hearing Zhuang Mohan recite the first 4 lines, Fan Xian felt much more at ease. Seeing that Master Zhuang still did not know that the Great River was the Yangtze, he knew that what he feared most had not happened. If he wanted to accuse Fan Xian of plagiarism, Zhuang Mohan could only rely on his own knowledge and reputation to suppress others. But he did not know how the eldest princess had persuaded Zhuang Mohan, who had always had a good reputation, to come all the way here to be a villain. After a long time, His Majesty frowned. Plagiarism was a serious accusation. If Zhuang Mohan did not have something to rely on, he would not have dared to make such irresponsible remarks in the palace of the Kingdom of Qin. Words are no proof. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Zhang Ziqian, who had been sitting next to Fan Xian, smiled. Master Zhuang Mohan is a master of his generation. When his students were young, they often studied the scriptures he had written. Naturally, no one in the world would dare to doubt his words. But in this case of plagiarism, perhaps he was deceived by a villain. He glanced at his superior's son, Guo Baoquan, and did not reveal who he was referring to. Zhuang Mohan raised his head. His eyes, which were full of wisdom, were filled with a complicated emotion. The last 4 lines of this poem were written by my master when he was traveling in Tingzhou. Because it was written by my master, I have kept it in my heart for decades. I don't know how Master Fan managed to come across these lines. Originally, I felt that it was good that the dust-burying pearl could see the light of day again. It's just that Master Fan is using this as an excuse to ask for my name, but I won't take it. A scholar's first priority is to cultivate his heart and virtue. I value talent as much as my life, and I do not wish to rashly expose this matter. My original intention was to come to the Kingdom of Qing and see what kind of person you are. Who would have thought that Master Fan would not repent? Instead, he has surpassed me. Fan Xian almost laughed in spite of himself. Shameless, he thought. But no one else could laugh. The atmosphere in front of the palace had long become oppressive. If this was true, not only would Fan Xian never have the face to enter the officialdom and literary circles, but the entire Qing court would lose all face. All the scholars in the world respected Zhuang Mohan's moral conduct and writings, and could not bring themselves to doubt him. Furthermore, Zhuang Mohan had said that it was written by his master. Given the hearts of the scholars in the world, this was tantamount to using his master's character as proof. Who would dare to doubt him? Deep in their hearts, the officials had already determined that Fan Xian's poem had been copied. They looked at him with strange disgust, but they could not let this matter become the truth. After all, this involved the face of the Kingdom of Qing. So His Majesty looked coldly at Grand Scholar Xu Wu of the Imperial Library. After a moment of awkwardness, Grand Scholar Xu stood up awkwardly and bowed to Zhuang Mohan. Greetings, Master. Grand Scholar Xu had traveled to northern Qi and received instruction from Zhuang Mohan, so they greeted him with the courtesy of a teacher and student. He had long since believed Zhuang Mohan's claim that Fan Xian's poem had been copied. But under His Majesty's stern gaze, he had no choice but to stand up and speak on Fan Xian's behalf. Master Fan has always been talented in poetry. Even this short song was excellent. It is hard to believe that he plagiarized it, and it does not seem necessary. Zhuang Mohan had already sat down. He coughed twice and warmly said, Shu Wu, could it be that you suspect I am stealing the name of my master? Grand Scholar Shu was sweating profusely and repeatedly said he did not dare. He no longer cared about His Majesty's cold gaze and obediently retreated. At this moment, if anyone still doubted him, it would be tantamount to saying that Zhuang Mohan was a shameless man who had no master or father. No one would dare bear this reputation. But His Majesty was no ordinary scholar. He was not Imperial Consort Shu, nor was he the Empress Dowager. He did not like Zhuang Mohan at all, so he coldly said, The kingdom of Qing values the law. It is somewhat different from the weak state of northern Qi. If Master Zhuang wishes to accuse someone of a crime, then you must have some proof. All the officials could hear that His Majesty was angry. If Zhuang Mohan really did accuse Fan Xian of plagiarism, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to ever see the light of day again. Zhuang Mohan smiled slightly and had his attendant bring out a piece of paper. This is my master's handwriting. If anyone from the Fang family were to look at it, they would naturally know the date. He looked at Fan Xian and said sympathetically, Master Fan is talented in poetry, but he is too preoccupied with drawing tigers. He does not know that poetry is the heart of the heart. How could the last 4 words of this poem, given Master Fan's experiences? Inside the hall, only Zhuang Mohan's slightly aged but incomparably steady voice could be heard interpreting the poem. 10,000 li of sorrow for autumn, how cold it is. 100 years of sickness. It was when my master, in his twilight years, ascended the heights alone. The torrential river filled the eyes with desolation. Master Fan, you are still young. How do you explain this 100 years of sickness? The more Zhuang Mohan spoke, the more everyone felt that such a poem could not have been written by a young man. Then they heard Zhuang Mohan's voice once again. Frost on the temples is a cluster of white hair. Master Fan with a head of black hair is a bit too forceful to describe. Finally Zhuang Mohan said softly, as for the last line, dejected, I stopped drinking from my mug. Let's not talk about Master Fan's glorious family background and how dejected he is, but I'm afraid Master Fan does not understand why my master said these words. He looked at Fan Xian, and there seemed to be some pity between his brows. My master contracted a lung disease in his later years, so he could not drink, so he used the words dejected. Hearing this, the officials of the kingdom of Qing finally lost their breath. There was no need for that piece of paper. With these unexplainable problems, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to escape the charge of plagiarism. Suddenly, there was a burst of applause in the quiet palace hall. Fan Xian, who had been leaning over the table in a drunken stupor, suddenly stood up and smiled at Zhuang Mohan. He slowly lowered his hand and in his heart he felt a bit of admiration. Naturally, no one knew who this Zhuang Mohan's master was, but for him to be able to deduce the circumstances of Du Fu's life and his illness from this poem, he was truly worthy of the title of the greatest master of literature in the world. But Fan Xian knew that Zhuang Mohan was trying to frame him, and that the piece of paper had probably already been dealt with, so he could not admire him to the end. A trace of madness appeared on his elegant face, and he laughed drunkenly. Today Zhuang Mohan does not even care about your master's reputation. I really don't know what has made you disregard your former reputation. Others thought that he had lost his mind after being exposed, and that his speech was becoming more and more unbearable. They all frowned. The Empress quietly ordered someone to call in the guards to prevent Fan Xian from doing anything rash. Unexpectedly, His Majesty waved his hand coldly, telling everyone to listen to what Fan Xian had to say. Fan Xian staggered out, his eyes full of ridicule and ridicule. Bring the wine, he yelled. The palace maids in the back saw his deranged expression and did not dare to come forward. An official, who had been feeling unjust on Fan Xian's behalf, brought over a jar of wine that weighed about 1 kilogram, and brought it to Fan Xian. Thank you. Fan Xian laughed and broke the clay seal on the wine jar. He lifted the jar and drank like a whale drinking from the ocean. In a moment, the wine had been poured into his stomach. After a drunken belch, he felt tipsy. He had drunk a lot that day, and now that he was in a rush to drink, his face was ruddy, his eyes sparkling, and his body swayed uncontrollably. He staggered to the head of the table like he was dancing, and pointed at Zhuang Mohan's nose. Master, do you really insist on saying this? Zhuang Mohan smelled the scent of wine and frowned slightly. It is good that you have a repentant heart. There is no need to hurt yourself like this. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and smiled slightly. His words seemed to be a little unclear. Everything has a cause and effect. Master Zhuang accused me of plagiarizing my teacher's 4 lines. Why did I copy it? Could it be that I cannot win this fame in life and in death just because of that short song from before? The words fame in life and in death were very good, and even Zhuang Mohan was moved. His mind was preoccupied with an urgent matter, and he had no choice but to deliberately frame the young man in front of him. He could not bear to do so, and he slowly moved his head away. Perhaps Master Fan also copied this poem. Copied from whom? Could it be that I wrote this poem was copied? Could it be that Master Zhuang's students are all over the world, and his poems are known all over the world, and you have the right to accuse me of plagiarism? Seeing Zhuang Mohan's finger lightly tapping on the scroll on the table, Fan Xian laughed coldly. Master Zhuang, this kind of trick may work on children, but you say that I copied your teacher's poem. I find it strange that before I wrote it, this poem has never appeared in this world. Zhuang Mohan did not seem to want to argue with him. It was Fan Xian who said in a soft voice, Master Zhuang, my hair is not white, so I cannot speak of the frost in my temples. My body is healthy, so I cannot speak of 100 years of illness. But you do not know that I have always liked to cause trouble, and I intend to start all over again in this life. You do not know my past, so you wrongly accuse me and harm me. How boring. He did not know whether it was because he had drunk too much, or because he had a rare opportunity to vent his pent-up depression, but Fan Xian's elegant face suddenly had a hint of madness. Poetry is the heart. Zhuang Mohan looked at him warmly. My young friend Fan did not have such a past, so how could you write this poem? Poetry is the way of literature. Fan Xian looked at him coldly. The way of poetry is always about talent. Perhaps my poem is a forced expression of sorrow, but who says that things that have not been experienced cannot be turned into one's own poetry? His words were extremely arrogant. He compared himself to a genius, using this to prove that all of Zhuang Mohan's deductions about poetry did not exist. Hearing this, Zhuang Mohan's eyebrows furrowed slightly. He laughed bitterly. Is Master Fan really capable of writing something that has nothing to do with his own experience? This master did not believe it. Even a genius in poetry would not have such ability. Seeing that the other had fallen into his trap, Fan Xian smiled slightly. He took the wine jug from the other's table and drank a mouthful. He looked at him quietly, the drunkenness in his eyes growing stronger. Suddenly he waved his sleeve and shouted 3 times. Paper. Ink. Servants. The drunken man shouted 3 times. Everyone in the hall did not understand what he meant. Only the emperor calmly ordered the serving girls to follow Fan Xian's orders. In a short while they had prepared everything. There was a large empty space in front of the hall. There was only a table, an inkstone, and a man standing alone and proudly in the center. Fan Xian could not stand still. He forced himself to bow to the emperor. I would like to borrow your majesty's writing eunuch. Although the emperor did not understand, he still lowered his head slightly and allowed it. A writing eunuch walked to the table and sat down. He spread out the white paper and ground the ink. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian resisted the drunkenness and shook his head. One is not enough. Fan Xian, what nonsense are you making? The crown prince, who was sitting close to him, could not help but speak. But the emperor still calmly granted his request. His eyes gradually revealed a smile, as if he had guessed what was about to happen. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Zhuang Mohan. The drunkenness in his eyes grew stronger. He spoke to the 3 eunuchs beside him. I'll read you write. If you write too slowly and don't copy it, I won't write it a second time. The 3 eunuchs became nervous for no reason. Many people were guessing what Fan Xian was preparing to do. How could he make the world, between him and Zhuang Mohan, believe that he was the true poet of his generation? It was not long into the night, and the wind at the end of summer was not very cool. But the atmosphere was like the sound of drums on a battlefield. Wildfire cannot burn, the spring wind blows, it grows again. Chaotic flowers gradually dazzle the eyes, only the shallow grass can cover the hooves of horses. The sky and the earth are eternal, but this hatred will never end. Without warning, without any preparation, Fan Xian blurted out a paragraph, all of which were written by Bai Juyi. In a short while there were more than a dozen poems. He stood by the table and gazed out at the night sky outside the palace. He recited all the famous poems that his strange brain could remember. The eunuchs wrote quickly, but they could not keep up with his speed. Everyone was silent, thinking carefully. In the face of endless conspiracies and schemes, Under great pressure he finally exploded. In his madness he only cared about reciting the poem in his mind. He did not care if the eunuchs remembered it or not, nor did he care if the people around him understood it. The fragrant words from his previous life passed through his thin lips, echoing endlessly in the palace of the kingdom of Qin. Zhuang Mohan's eyes gradually changed in a strange way, and the officials who had been purely watching the show could not help but mutter to themselves. They had never heard of any of these poems, but they were truly wonderful sentences. Could it be that they were all written by Master Fan? The sky wishes for snow in the evening to drink a cup. This was by Ledian drinking. Do you not see? Next it was Tai Bai Lishan's turn to drink. The shadows formed 3 people. This was Tai Bai Ledian still drinking. But the master can get the guest drunk. This was Tai Bai Ledian still drinking. Those who abandoned me yesterday cannot be kept. Those who disturb my heart today is full of worries. This was Tai Bai Ledian drinking. The people in the palace no longer cared about their lack of etiquette. Gradually they sat around Fan Xian, listening to him recite poem after poem. Their faces were full of shock and disbelief. Everyone had ears to listen to a poem. There were many geniuses in the world, but since ancient times, there had never been a scene like this. They had seen poems, but they had never seen one like this. Composing a poem was definitely not like carrying cabbages in a market. But countless lines of poetry poured out of Fan Xian's mouth, as if he didn't need to think about it. It was no different from carrying cabbages. Although some of the lines in these poems were strange, that was because the officials did not know of the illusions of that world. But the officials were still shocked and frightened. These poems, each one was excellent. Fan Xian still did not stop. The officials began to look at Fan Xian strangely. They felt that this elegant young man in front of them was no longer of the mortal world, but a descendant of the heavens. In their fear, the scholars of the imperial library, who had long since sobered up, replaced the 3 eunuchs whose wrists were weak. They began to bury their heads and diligently copy the lines of poetry. Sir Fan Jr. had said earlier that he would only say it once. Fan Xian did not know what was happening around him. His eyes remained closed, his mind working quickly. On one hand he was recalling these lines of poetry, and on the other he was thinking about what to do next. If the officials knew that he had the spare time to think about other things, they would probably be even more shocked. He felt a little thirsty, so he stretched his hand into the air beside him. A perceptive imperial scholar had already brought wine over and carefully placed it in his hand, afraid to disturb his current mood. From the book of songs about a gentleman's desire for sex, to Gong Zizhen's silence of 10,000 horses, the bright moonlight of the Tang dynasty, the spring river of the Song dynasty, Du Fu building a thatched hut, Su Dongpa cooking Huangzhou fish, Du Mu visiting a prostitute, Lu Sanbian also visiting a prostitute, Yuan Zhen once having a mistress, Li an embroidered zither thinking about his youth, and Ouyang Xiu loving his niece to death. Fan Xian closed his eyes, took a sip of wine and composed a poem. 3 jugs of wine, 300 poems. In the spacious palace, there seemed to be countless lights and shadows dancing, gradually condensing into a picture that he could only see clearly with his eyes closed. It was the family of poets from his previous life, the old handsome man and the young handsome man from his previous life, singing under the bamboo, bearing their bellies on the bed, walking on the great path in the pavilion, and weeping by the river. This was everything from his previous life. Everything from Fan Xian's previous life had suddenly descended upon the world of the kingdom of Qin, striking at everyone's hearts. Fan Xian, with the help of countless heroes from his previous life, was battling Zhuang Mohan. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked coldly at Zhuang Mohan, but it was as if he was looking at some distant world. Do you not see the waters of the yellow river come from the heavens? Who could be more free and easy than Li Bai? The waves wash away the heroes of the ages. Who could be more heroic than Su Shi? Last night's rain was light and the wind was strong, and a deep sleep did not dispel the lingering wine. Who could be more graceful than Li Qingzhao? How could the heroes of the ages be defeated by one man? With a crisp clang, Zhuang Mohan's trembling hands could no longer hold onto the wine cup. The cup fell to the stone floor, shattering into countless pieces. Silence. Silence. After some time, Fan Xian finally stopped his crazy performance, but the people in the great hall of the kingdom of Qing's palace were still unable to shake off their emotions. The scholars and eunuchs, who had already been replaced a few times, were the first to wake up. They fell to the ground, rubbing their sore right hands, looking at Fan Xian as if he were a god. Fan Xian had drunk too much. He staggered over to Zhuang Mohan, stretched out a finger to point at his nose and shook it. After a drunken hiccup, he said softly, "In interpreting scriptures, I am not as good as you. In writing poetry, you are not as good as me." The hall was still silent, so although these words were spoken very softly, they fell clearly into everyone's ears. The officials of course believed these words. They had long since prostrated themselves in admiration of Sir Fan Jr.'s poetic talent. No matter how high Zhuang Mohan's reputation was when it came to poetry, anyone who had heard Fan Xian recite 300 ancient poems would never believe that anyone could surpass Fan Xian in poetry. At this time, there was no need to bring up the matter of plagiarism. Everyone had long believed Fan Xian's words. There were so-called geniuses in this world, people who did not need to experience certain things, and yet could still write astonishing poems. What was that just now? That was the skill of immortals in poetry. Copy my ass, attack my ass. Since no one believed that Fan Xian with his talent would still copy poetry, then naturally Zhuang Mohan was lying. At this time, everyone in the hall looked at Zhuang Mohan with disappointment, pity, and disdain. They thought that this great master of his generation, who had lived half his life with a clean reputation, had unexpectedly fallen short of virtue in his old age, fighting for fame with a younger generation. Zhuang Mohan looked at Fan Xian as if he were looking at a monster. His eyes revealed a gloomy expression, and for some reason, his chest suddenly tightened. He covered his mouth with his white sleeve and spat out a mouthful of blood. The emperor's expression was one of a smile that was not a smile. He looked at Fan Xian and said, "With such talent, why don't you show it normally?" Fan Xian seemed drunk but not drunk. He looked back at the emperor and said, "Poetry is something to cultivate one's character, not a skill to fight bravely." These words were a little shameless. Wasn't he fighting bravely and ruthlessly tonight? Fan Xian finally could not hold back his complaints and the smell of alcohol. He fell on his butt on the steps in front of the emperor. He squinted at Zhuang Mohan, whose lips were trembling slightly. He mumbled, "I am drunk and want to sleep. Go to hell." Finally, he finished his last pose of Li Tai Bai's, and Fan Xian fell into a drunken dream at the emperor's feet. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.